There is a cave in northern Canada that does not appear on any federal map produced after 1907. It was surveyed once by a team of 7 men who departed from a rail camp near the Liard River in the summer of 1904, and it was never officially surveyed again. 3 of those men came back. The other 4 are listed in a single line of government correspondence archived in Ottawa, a line that reads, in its entirety, that the survey of the northern interior drainage encountered conditions incompatible with continued fieldwork and was discontinued by order of the supervising officer. That is all the record says. No further explanation. No names of the missing. No date of the order. Just that one sentence, sitting inside a manila folder that was misfiled under the wrong territorial designation for 61 years before a records clerk in 1968 noticed it and moved it to the correct drawer, where it sat for another 9 years before anyone looked at it again. The person who finally looked at it in 1977 was a graduate student named Constance Fallow, who was writing a master's thesis on the administrative history of the Northwest Territories boundary surveys. She was not looking for mysteries. She was looking for clerical discrepancies in how survey teams were funded and reported, a deeply unglamorous corner of Canadian administrative history that almost nobody studied. But when she pulled the 1904 Liard corridor file and found that single line sitting where a full survey report should have been, she wrote a note to herself in the margin of her research journal. The note said, 4 men do not vanish from a survey record without someone deciding that is what should happen. She spent the next 3 years trying to find out what had been decided and why. What she found was not an answer. It was something stranger than an answer. It was a pattern of absence. Every document that should have touched the 1904 expedition had been either removed, never created, or filed in a location so counterintuitive that its presence there could only be explained by deliberate misfiling. The survey crew's individual personnel records were missing from the Northwest Territories field employment ledger. The equipment requisition that would have listed what the 7 men carried into the bush was missing from the Dominion Lands Branch supply records. The field notes, which survey teams were required by regulation to submit within 60 days of returning to a rail camp, were never submitted. And the supervising officer, named nowhere in the record because the one-sentence summary did not include his name, could not be identified from any roster of active survey personnel for that year. Constance Fallow finished her thesis on a different topic, but she never stopped thinking about the 1904 Liard Cave expedition, and in 1981, she published a 14-page article in a small Canadian history journal, laying out everything she had found and everything she had failed to find. The article drew almost no attention. The journal had a circulation of roughly 400 academics, most of whom worked in administrative and economic history and had no particular interest in northern exploration. But one person who read it was a retired geologist named Arthur Hebb, who had spent 30 years working in the Canadian North for a mining survey company, and who recognized something in Fallow's description of the territory that she had no way of knowing was significant. He wrote her a letter. The letter described, in careful and specific terms, a feature of the Liard River Plateau geology that Hebb had encountered during a company survey in 1963. He described a limestone formation of unusual depth that his team had been instructed by a company supervisor whose instructions had arrived by telephone from a head office he had never seen, and from a person who had never given him a name, not to document in the survey report. He had documented it privately in his personal field journal instead, and the location he described, adjusted for the 40-year difference in survey grid reference systems, corresponded precisely to the area where Constance Fallow's 1904 expedition had been operating when it stopped. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time is it. I read every comment and I find it affecting in a real way. Someone in Yellowknife at midnight, someone in Vancouver at 2 in the morning, someone in Halifax hearing this for the first time and not quite ready to close their eyes. We are all in this together, reaching back through the same long dark towards something that refuses to be fully explained. Arthur Hebb and Constance Fallow met in person for the first time in the autumn of 1982 in Edmonton. They spent 2 days going through their combined research. At the end of those 2 days, They had identified a coherent set of facts, not rumors, not speculation, but documented facts, each one sourced and verifiable, that pointed in the same direction. A limestone cave system of significant depth existed in a specific and identifiable location in northern British Columbia near the Yukon border. It had been found, entered, and partially explored by a government survey team in the summer of 1904. Something had happened inside that cave that caused 4 of the 7 men on that team to not come back out, and a decision had been made, at some level of government authority, to ensure that the full account of what happened would never enter the public record. That is the starting point. That is what we know from the documents. Everything beyond that starting point requires us to follow the threads that Fallow and Hebb pulled, and then the threads that others pulled after them, through 4 decades of increasingly careful and increasingly unsettling research. And I want to be clear about something before we go any further, because this kind of history demands that clarity. The researchers whose work I am going to describe were not conspiracy theorists. They were not people who arrived at a conclusion and worked backward to find evidence for it. They were careful, methodical people who followed documentary evidence wherever it led them, who reported honestly when evidence was ambiguous or absent, and who were consistently more conservative in their claims than the evidence might have allowed them to be. Constance Fallow spent 40 years on this question. She was still working on it when she died in 2019. Arthur Hebb left his personal field journals to a university archive in his will. They are publicly accessible, you can go read them. The cave itself, let us start there, because that is where everything else begins. The limestone plateau north of the Liard River, in what is now far northwestern British Columbia, sits at the edge of one of the least studied geological regions in North America. It is an area of roughly 12,000 square kilometers, where the bedrock is a specific formation of Devonian-age limestone, laid down approximately 380 million years ago, when the region was a shallow tropical sea. Over the subsequent 380 million years, that limestone has been dissolved, fractured, folded, and carved by water and ice into a landscape of extraordinary complexity. Surface features include sinkholes, disappearing streams, dry valleys, and what geologists call karst terrain, which means terrain shaped primarily by the dissolution of soluble rock. But the surface complexity is minor compared to what lies beneath it. Devonian limestone of this age and composition tends to cave. Water finds cracks, dissolves the rock, widens the cracks into passages, carves out chambers, and over millions of years creates cave systems that can extend for dozens of kilometers at depths of hundreds of meters. The Liard Plateau is geologically predisposed to contain caves, and not small caves but systems of potentially extraordinary scale. And yet, as of the late 19th century, the caves of this region were almost entirely unknown to the scientific community. The area was remote, the winters were brutal, the logistics of exploration were daunting, and the indigenous peoples of the region, the Cascadena and the Taltan, had their own extensive knowledge of the terrain, but their own reasons for not sharing all of it with the surveyors and prospectors who were moving through their territory with increasing frequency in the years following the Klondike Gold Rush. The 1904 expedition did not set out specifically to find a cave. The Dominion of Canada was engaged in a broad program of interior surveying during the first decade of the 20th century, driven partly by the need to establish territorial boundaries and partly by the anticipation of mineral development that the gold rush had made suddenly plausible across the entire northern interior. Survey teams were being dispatched into territories that had never been formally mapped, with instructions to document geology, hydrology, topography, and timber resources, as well as to establish survey benchmarks that future expeditions could use as reference points. The 7 men who departed from the Liard River Rail Camp in July of 1904 were part of that broad program. They were assigned to survey a specific drainage basin, the one that Fallow's research eventually identified as the Tethered Creek Drainage, a watershed that has since been absorbed into a provincial parks designation and is now labelled on modern maps only as the Upper Unnamed Drainage, which is itself an unusual designation for a named watershed that had a name as recently as 1962. The team's composition, reconstructed by Fallow from scattered personnel references across multiple archives, included a supervising surveyor, a assistant surveyor, 2 chainmen who handled the physical measurements, a cook, a packer responsible for the horses and equipment, and a naturalist whose presence Fallow could not fully explain within the standard parameters of a Dominion survey at that time. Naturalists were occasionally attached to survey teams, but usually for expeditions of significantly greater scope and duration than what a single drainage basin survey would have warranted. The presence of this 7th person suggested to Fallow that the 1904 expedition had a secondary purpose that was not recorded in its official mandate. The names of the 3 men who returned are known. Fallow found them through an indirect route, through a newspaper notice in a White Horse Weekly from October 1904, which mentioned in passing that 3 members of a summer survey party had arrived at the local land office to file a report and would be departing southward by the next available transport. The newspaper did not print their names, but the land office register for October 1904 was preserved in the Yukon archives, and it recorded the names of everyone who visited the office during that month. Cross-referencing the Dominion Lands Branch employment records for surveyors active in 1904, Fallow was able to identify 2 of the 3 men with reasonable confidence. The 3rd remained uncertain. The names of the 4 men who did not return were, for nearly a century, completely unknown. This in itself is notable. Government survey teams in 1904 were not informal operations. They were documented, regulated enterprises whose participants had employment records, supply requisitions, and correspondence files. The total disappearance of 4 people from a government operation of this kind was not something that happened accidentally. It required effort. Fallow eventually found those 4 names, but not in any Canadian archive. She found them in a private letter collection that had been donated to a small university library in the state of Montana, in the United States. The collection had belonged to a man named Horace Dunmire, who had worked as a supply contractor for the Dominion Lands Branch in the early years of the century and had maintained personal copies of correspondence that the official record did not preserve. Among his papers was a letter dated August 1904, written to Dunmire by a contact at the Liard rail camp, describing the return of a survey party. The letter named the 3 survivors and named the 4 who were not with them. And then it said something that Constance Fallow found more significant than the names themselves. It said that the 3 men who came back were not talking about what they had found, not refusing to talk, not prevented from talking, at least not yet, just not talking. The letter writer, who was present at the rail camp when the 3 men arrived, described them as men who had come in from the bush looking like they had crossed something they were not supposed to cross, and who sat by the stove for 2 days drinking tea and not answering questions, not hostile, not distressed in any way that the letter writer could put his finger on, just finished with something, in the way that a person is finished with something they have decided not to carry any further. The letter writer's name was Gideon Peel. He had been at the Liard camp as a timber cruiser, estimating merchantable timber volumes for a private company. He was not a government employee. He had no official obligation to anyone's version of events. And reading his letter in a Montana archive in 1986, Constance Fallow felt, for the first time in her years of researching this question, that she was hearing the voice of someone who had actually been there. She spent the next 6 months trying to find out everything that could be found about Gideon Peel. What she learned about him is one of the more compelling threads in this entire story, and it is worth following it carefully. Peel was 31 years old in the summer of 1904. He was born in Ontario and had been working in the northern interior as a timber cruiser for about 5 years at that point, which meant he was experienced enough in the bush to read the state of a returning party accurately. He was not a naive observer. His letter to Dunmire was the only piece of his correspondence that Fallow was able to locate in any archive, and it had survived only because Dunmire had happened to keep it. But in her search for Peel, Fallow found something unexpected. She found that Gideon Peel had made a second trip to the Liard Plateau 2 years after the 1904 expedition, in the summer of 1906, and that this second trip had not been a professional timber cruise. He had gone back on his own, with a single companion, whose name does not appear in any document Fallow found, carrying supplies for a month-long backcountry journey. He came back from that trip 3 weeks early and alone. His companion did not come back with him. Peel left the north after the 1906 trip and never returned. He spent the rest of his working life in southern Ontario, in a profession as far from the wilderness as he could find, working as a bookkeeper for a hardware merchant in Hamilton until his retirement. He died in 1947. He left no memoir, no diary that Fallow could locate, no correspondence beyond the one letter in Dunmire's Montana collection. He had gone back into the bush to look for something, or to find out something, or possibly to undo something. And whatever he found or failed to find or could not undo had been enough to make him spend the next 40 years not going back. This is the shape of the mystery at its core, not a dramatic confrontation with something unknown and terrifying, though we will get to what the documents suggest about what the 1904 expedition actually found. But first, this: a pattern of people who went in, came back, changed, and then did what they could to be somewhere else for the rest of their lives. Now, let us talk about the cave itself, because that is what everything circles back to, and because the physical description of it that survives in the documentary record is one of the most unusual descriptions of any geological feature in Canadian archival history. The description does not come from the 1904 expedition's own field notes, which, as we have established, do not exist in any archive. It comes from two other sources that Fallow and, later, a geologist named Raymond Costello identified independently and then cross-referenced. The first source is a Casca Denner oral account that was collected by an ethnologist named Margaret Drury in 1938 as part of a broader documentation project sponsored by the Canadian government's Indian Affairs branch. Drury was working in the Liard River region, interviewing Casca elders about traditional land use, seasonal camps, hunting territories, and associated place name knowledge. The work she produced filled 3 field journals, which were submitted to Indian Affairs in Ottawa and which sat in a storage facility for many years before being transferred to the National Archives, where Raymond Costello found them in 2001. The account of the cave appears in Drury's second field journal. Collected from an elder she identifies only by his Casca name, which she transcribes phonetically, and which Costello, working with a Casca language specialist, was able to tentatively identify as a name meaning roughly the man who stays at the edge. The elder was describing traditional restrictions on movement within specific parts of Casca territory, restrictions that the Casca understood as having been established by their ancestors, and that carried spiritual as well as practical authority. Most of the restrictions Drury recorded were tied to seasonal hunting management, to the protection of calving grounds or fish runs, or to the marking of boundaries between neighbouring territorial groups. But the restriction the elder described in connection with the limestone plateau near the Tethered Creek drainage was different in kind from all the others. It was not about hunting or fishing or boundaries. It was about a specific place in the ground, a specific opening in the rock that the elder described with a Casca phrase that Drury translates as the place where the stone speaks. The elder told Drury, through a young interpreter who was also present, that the place where the stone speaks was known to the Casca as a place that had been there before any living memory and before the memory of anyone's grandparents or great-grandparents, a place that the oldest stories said had been found long before the Casca themselves came to this part of the country, by people who had come from a direction that the elder indicated by gesturing toward the northwest, which would be roughly toward the Yukon and Alaska. He said that those older people had entered the place and had come out changed, and that some of them had not come out at all. And he said that the Casca rule about the place was simple and had not changed in all the generations since it had been established. The rule was that no one went there. Drury asked, through the interpreter, what the place looked like. The elder described an opening in the limestone, not a dramatic cliff face or an obvious cave mouth, but a place where the rock simply went down, at an angle, like a staircase that someone had placed into the hillside. He said the opening was wide enough for 2 people to walk in, side by side. He said the rock immediately inside the opening was different in colour from the limestone around it. And here Drury notes in her journal that she could not tell if the elder meant different in colour from weathering, different because of mineral deposits, or different in a way that implied something the interpreter was struggling to render in English. The translation the interpreter finally offered was that the rock inside the opening was the colour of old water. The elder would not say anything more about the physical interior of the cave. He said that describing what was inside was not permitted. He said the prohibition was not because knowledge of the interior was sacred, in the way that ceremonial knowledge was sacred, but because describing it was understood to be an invitation for the description to be acted upon, and that the point of not going there was undermined if you gave someone a reason to want to go. The second source is the one that Raymond Costello found in 2001, about a year after he encountered Drury's journals, and it is the document that, in Costello's view, confirmed that the 1904 expedition had found what the Casca Elder was describing. It is a letter, typed on government stationery, from the office of the Deputy Minister of the Interior, dated March of 1906. It is addressed to a man named Fletcher Ashe, who was the director of the Dominion Land Survey at that time. The letter is short. It instructs Ashe to ensure that the survey record for the 1904 Liard Corridor operation is amended to reflect that the northern section of the Tethered Creek drainage was not surveyed due to terrain conditions, and that no further survey operations are to be authorized in that drainage without specific written approval from the Deputy Minister's office. The letter is signed. The signature is legible. And in the upper left corner of the letter, below the departmental letterhead, someone has written by hand, in pencil, 4 words that Costello photographed and had examined by 2 separate document analysts who confirmed the pencil notation was contemporaneous with the letter itself. The 4 words are, "Do not go back." Costello spent 2 years attempting to identify whose handwriting the pencil notation was in. He could not. The notation was not in Ashe's hand, which Costello could verify from other documents bearing Ashe's signature. It was not in the hand of the Deputy Minister who signed the letter, which Costello similarly verified. It appeared to be the handwriting of someone who had encountered this letter in transit or in filing, someone who had read it and felt moved to add something to it before passing it along, or before filing it in the location where it eventually ended up, which was not the Dominion Land Survey records, but a completely different departmental file related to geological surveys of a different region entirely. The letter was in the wrong file. The wrong file was in the wrong archive building. It had been placed there in a way that would have made it nearly impossible to find unless you were looking for something else and stumbled across it, which is precisely how Costello found it. He was looking for documentation related to a 1903 geological survey of the Peace River country when he came across the 1906 letter in a folder that should have contained only Peace River materials. The folder had been misfiled in the 1910s, sat untouched through 2 archival reorganizations, and survived the general purge of redundant federal records in the 1950s, only because the whole drawer it occupied had been incorrectly labeled and was overlooked. Costello's accidental discovery of it was the kind of archival event that happens occasionally in historical research, and that researchers who work with government records learn to treat neither as miraculous nor as evidence of conspiracy, but simply as the natural result of the fact that government records are imperfect systems managed by imperfect people over very long periods of time. But the pencil notation was not the result of an imperfect system. Someone had written those words deliberately. At this point in the research history, we need to introduce a third researcher, because the questions that Fallow and Hebb and Costello had identified were not going to be answered from the documentary record alone, and because the most important evidence about what the 1904 expedition actually found came not from archives, but from the land itself. Her name is Ren Asadurian, and she is a cave geologist, which is a specific subspecialty within the broader field of speleology. She studies cave systems for a living, specifically their physical formation, the mineralogy of their interiors, and what their structure can tell us about the geological history of the regions they occupy. She has mapped cave systems on 4 continents. She holds positions at 2 universities. She has been working on what she calls the Liard Plateau question since 2003, when she read Costello's paper in a speleology journal and recognized something in his description of the geological setting that she had not seen in his published account, but that she knew, from her own experience in Devonian limestone systems, was potentially significant. She contacted Costello, who shared with her everything he had, and then she went north. The first thing Asadurian established, through a combination of satellite imaging, aerial photography, and ground survey was that a large cave system almost certainly existed in the location that the documentary record was pointing toward. The surface karst features, the sinkholes and disappearing streams and dry valleys, visible from aerial photographs, were consistent with a cave system of potentially enormous extent directly beneath. She estimated, from the surface evidence alone, that the system might extend for 20 to 30 kilometers in horizontal length and reach depths of 200 to 300 meters. This would make it one of the largest cave systems in Western Canada, comparable in scale to the Castleguard system beneath the Columbia icefield, which is the longest known cave in Canada at approximately 20 kilometers. The second thing she established was that the cave's entrance, if the surface evidence was telling her what it usually tells her in terrain of this type, would be located in a very specific part of the plateau. The hydrology of a karst system follows water, and water in this terrain follows the slope of the underlying bedrock. Asadoorian mapped the bedrock slope from borehole data and surface measurements, and traced the likely location of a major cave entrance to a point on the landscape that she could identify with reasonable precision on a modern topographic map. And that location, when she plotted it against Fallow's reconstruction of the 1904 expedition's route, was squarely in the zone where the expedition's documented activity ended. They had found the entrance. There was essentially no doubt about that, in Asadoorian's assessment. The survey party had been moving through terrain that would have led them directly to a major cave entrance, and the moment at which the documentary record goes silent about what they were doing corresponds precisely to the moment when, given their documented rate of travel and the terrain they were crossing, they would have been standing at the place where the rock simply went down. The third thing Asadoorian established required more time, more equipment, and more courage, because it required her to go inside. She spent 3 field seasons gaining access to the cave, because the plateau is remote, and the logistics of getting there with sufficient equipment and support are in fact daunting. She went in with a small team, always with full safety protocols, never alone, always with surface communication. What she found inside the cave is documented in her field journals, copies of which she deposited with 2 separate universities under restricted access. She has also published in the peer-reviewed literature those aspects of her findings that she is comfortable characterizing as clear-cut geological observations. But there are aspects of her findings that do not appear in her published papers. They appear in her field journals and in conversations she has given to researchers she trusts, and in a recorded interview she gave to Costello in 2011 that has not been publicly released. She has described these aspects as observations she cannot account for within her current understanding of cave geology, and for which she has not yet developed an adequate explanatory framework. This is an unusual thing for a scientist of her standing to say. She is not given to imprecision. She is not the kind of researcher who reaches for unexplained when the real word she means is interesting. When she describes something as beyond her explanatory framework, the people who know her work understand that she means it literally. What she is willing to say publicly, and what she said to Costello on the record in 2011, is this: the cave is large, much larger than the surface evidence had suggested. Her estimate of its horizontal extent has been revised upward significantly over 3 field seasons, and she now believes it may be one of the most extensive cave systems in North America, larger than Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, which at more than 670 kilometers of surveyed passage, is currently the longest known cave system in the world. She believes the Liard Plateau system may exceed that. She cannot yet say by how much because she has not been able to reach its limits. The cave contains mineralogy that she describes as anomalous for a Devonian limestone system of this age. Specifically, there are zones of crystalline formation in certain chambers that she cannot explain by standard speleothem growth processes. These formations are not stalactites or stalagmites, or the flowstone sheets that typically decorate limestone caves. They are something else, something that she does not have established nomenclature for, and that her published papers describe only as unusual crystal aggregates of uncertain formation mechanism. The cave contains, at specific points along its main passage, modifications that she cannot attribute to natural processes. These are not large modifications. They are subtle. They would be easy to miss if you were not looking carefully. But she was looking carefully, and she found them. Niches cut into the wall at regular intervals, too regular to be natural, too small to be shelves for equipment, but the right size and shape for a particular kind of torch mount used in underground exploration in the early 20th century. Marks on the cave floor at certain junctions where the passage branched, marks that are consistent with survey cairns, the small stone piles that survey parties traditionally use to mark their route and ensure they can find their way back. And in one chamber, deep in the system, at a depth that required hours of travel from the surface, something that Asadorian describes in her field journal with a single, careful sentence. A coat, hanging from a natural limestone boss that protruded from the wall at shoulder height, folded over it neatly, as if someone had taken it off and set it there and intended to come back for it. The coat was in exceptional condition, given its apparent age. Asadorian took samples of the fabric and had them analysed. The analysis returned a date range consistent with manufacture in the late 19th or very early 20th century. Asadorian left the coat where it was. She photographed it. She documented its location with the precision her training demands. And then she noted in her field journal, with the same careful understatement she applies to everything she describes in this cave, that the coat was folded in the way that someone folds a coat when they expect to be somewhere long enough to want it again later, and that there was no one in the chamber with her, and that the passage ahead, continuing into the deeper system, showed evidence of having been travelled. The question of what the 1904 expedition found inside the cave is the question that everything else in this story orbits. It is the question that Constance Fallow spent 40 years approaching from the outside through documents and correspondence and archival traces. It is the question that drew Gideon Peele back in 1906 and then sent him south for the rest of his life. It is the question that caused someone in the Canadian government in March of 1906 to write a letter instructing that the record be altered and that no one go back, and to receive that letter with a pencil notation that said, in 4 words, exactly what the official letter said in bureaucratic circumlocution: do not go back. But the question of what the 1904 expedition found is not a simple question, because the expedition found more than one thing. The cave itself was one discovery, what was in the cave was another, and what the cave did to the people who entered it, or what happened to the people who entered it while they were inside, was perhaps the most significant discovery of all, and the one that the record works hardest to contain. Let us follow the 3 survivors. Constance Fallow identified them, with varying degrees of certainty, from the Whitehorse Land Office Register cross-referenced against Dominion Land Survey employment records. The 2 she was confident about were a man named William Crace, who had worked as a chainman on survey parties in the Northwest Territories since 1899, and a man named Maurice Elgin, who held the position of packer, responsible for the expedition's horses and equipment. The 3rd person, the one she was less certain about, was a woman. This was unexpected. Dominion Land Survey crews in 1904 did not typically include women. The work was physically demanding, the conditions were brutal, the institutional culture of the survey service was overwhelmingly male, and there is no record in Fallow's extensive research of any other Dominion survey crew of that period that included a female participant in any capacity. But the Land Office Register for October 1904 includes a surname that Fallow's cross-referencing, identified as belonging to a woman who had been working in the Northern Territories as a naturalist's assistant. Naturalists, unlike surveyors, did sometimes employ women in this period, particularly in the capacity of specimen preparators or field assistants for natural history collections. And this would explain the presence of the naturalist on the crew, the 7th person whose inclusion Fallow had initially found puzzling. The naturalist may have brought his assistant, and his assistant may have been the woman whose name appears in the Land Office Register. Her name was Vera Sobieski. She was 26 years old in 1904. She was the daughter of Polish immigrants who had settled in Manitoba, and she had trained at the Manitoba Provincial Museum before finding work with a series of scientific expeditions as a preparator, someone who preserved and documented biological specimens. She spoke 3 languages, kept meticulous records, and was by all accounts an extraordinarily competent observer of natural phenomena. She had been in the North for 2 summers before 1904. She was also the only survivor who, after returning from the expedition, wrote anything down. What she wrote is not a full account of the expedition, and it is not a confession, and it is not a warning. It is a series of brief entries in a notebook that she kept for several months after her return. Entries that deal with mundane things: her living arrangements in Whitehorse, her correspondence with her mother in Manitoba, her attempts to find work. But scattered through these mundane entries are passages that Fallow found when she finally located the notebook in a private collection in Winnipeg in 1993. Unlike anything else in the historical record of the 1904 expedition, the notebook was in the possession of a descendant of Sobieski's sister, a woman named Tilda Karras, who was in her 80s when Fallow interviewed her, and who had inherited the notebook among a collection of family papers without having understood its significance. Karras knew that her great-aunt Vera had worked in the north and had some kind of difficult experience there, but her understanding was vague and coloured by the passage of decades and the natural compression that family stories undergo when they are not actively maintained. She had assumed, from the little she had been told, that the difficulty was physical hardship, perhaps an accident or a bad winter. She had not known that 4 people had died, or failed to come back, or whatever the precise category for their absence was. When Fallow told her what she had found in the archival record, Tilda Karras sat quietly for a moment and then said that it was interesting because her great-aunt Vera had always been described in family memory as a person who came back from the north different. Not damaged, not broken, just different in the way that a room is different after something large has been moved through it and the furniture rearranged, even if everything looks essentially the same. The notebook passages that Fallow found significant are not long. They do not describe events in any direct way. They seem to be the product of someone working through something obliquely, finding a way to think about it that does not require stating it plainly. Fallow transcribed them carefully, with full awareness that she was applying her own interpretive framework to private writing that was never intended for any audience. She tried, in her published account of the notebook, to let the passages speak as much as possible for themselves. The first relevant passage is from November 1904, about 6 weeks after the return to Whitehorse. It reads, "I have been trying to understand the difference between what is there and what you bring with you, and whether the difference matters if the result is the same." This is not, on its face, a very illuminating sentence, but Fallow notes that it is the first of several passages in which Sobieski distinguishes between categories of experience in a way that implies she is working through an event in which the distinction between subjective and objective was, in fact, unclear. The second passage is from December 1904. It reads, "The thing about limestone is that it remembers. Every crack, every chamber, every surface was once something else, and the chemistry of that transformation is preserved in the rock. You can read it if you know how. I wonder if that is also true of the kind of formation that I am thinking of, whether the chemistry of what happened there is preserved in the structure in a way that someone with the right knowledge could read. I wonder who has that knowledge and whether they have read it." The third passage is from January 1905, and it is the one that Fallow spent most time with. It reads, "There are 4 of them. I understand now that this was not an accident, and not a failure, and not an outcome that anyone on the team could have prevented. The 4 went deeper, because the deeper you go, the more you understand what you are looking at. And once you understand what you are looking at, it is very difficult to want to come back to a place where you do not have that understanding. This is not a reassurance. I am not writing this to comfort myself. I am writing it because it is the most accurate description I can produce of what happened, and accuracy is the only thing I have left that feels like something I am actually holding." Fallow published these passages in her 2003 paper on the Sobieski notebook. The paper was more widely read than her 1981 article, partly because the field of Canadian historical studies had grown since 1981, and partly because Costello had already published his analysis of the 1906 Deputy Minister's letter, which had attracted some attention in the history of science community. The 2 papers together created a small community of researchers with a shared interest in the 1904 expedition, people who had read both and who were now, in various ways, pulling at the same threads from different directions. One of those researchers was a man named Julian Harkness, who was not a historian or a geologist, but a linguist. He had come to the question from a completely different direction from everyone else, through his study of Kaska oral traditions, which he had been working with for 15 years. in collaboration with Casca communities, and which had given him access to an extensive body of traditional knowledge about the Liard Plateau region. In 2004, he published a paper that none of the other researchers in this community had anticipated because it addressed a question none of them had thought to ask. It asked who else had entered the cave before 1904. The Casca oral traditions that Harkness had access to contained, as he had discovered through patient relationship building with community knowledge holders, accounts of the place where the stone speaks that extended back much further than any European contact. The accounts were not detailed in the way that a survey log would be detailed. They were formalized in the way that oral traditions encode important knowledge through consistent structure and repeated elements that allow the knowledge to be transmitted accurately across generations. And what the encoded knowledge said, in summary, was that the cave had been known to people in this region for as long as there was any memory of anyone being in this region, and that the restriction on entering it had not been established by the Casca. It had been inherited by them, along with a significant body of other traditional knowledge, from people who had been on this land before them. Harkness was careful in how he framed this, because he was working with knowledge that had been shared with him in trust and that carried its own protocols about how it could be used. He did not quote directly from the traditional accounts. He characterized them with the approval of the knowledge holders he was working with, and what he characterized was this: the understanding that the cave was not to be entered predated the Casca presence in the region by an unspecified but significant period, and the rationale for the prohibition, as it had been passed down, was not that the cave was dangerous in the way that a dangerous cliff face or a swift river is dangerous. It was that the cave changed people in a way that was permanent and that was not reversible once it had happened. The Casca word that the oral tradition used to describe what happened to people who entered the cave was, Harkness reported, a word that in its most literal rendering meant finished with the surface, as in finished with the surface of the earth, as in done with what is available to someone who lives their life above the rock. This does not mean that entering the cave was understood as death. The oral tradition was explicit, Harkness said, that people who entered the cave and went deep enough did not die. They transitioned to a state of being that was not available to people who had not made that transition. And the reason the restriction existed was not that this transition was bad, necessarily, but that it was permanent, and that once it had occurred, the person who had experienced it could not return to ordinary life without bringing something of that other state back with them, something that the surface world was not equipped to contain. Vera Sobieski's notebook passage from January 1905 described this more precisely than she could have known she was describing it. The four went deeper, because the deeper you go, the more you understand what you are looking at. Once you understand what you are looking at, it is very difficult to want to come back to a place where you do not have that understanding. The pattern of absence that Constance Fallow had identified at the very beginning of her research, the pattern of people who went in, came back, changed, and did what they could to be somewhere else for the rest of their lives, was not a pattern of trauma. It was a pattern of incompatibility. The three people who came back from the 1904 expedition had come back from the threshold of something, and the experience of reaching that threshold and then stepping back from it had made ordinary life feel inadequate in a way that no amount of time or distance could fully resolve. Gideon Peel came back from the rail camp in 1906 alone. His companion from that second trip, whose name Fallow never found, had done what four of the 1904 team had done. He had gone deeper. Whether Peel had failed to stop his companion or had watched him choose to go and decided not to follow, the outcome was the same. Peel came south and stayed south and worked as a bookkeeper in Hamilton for 40 years and did not talk about what he had seen. He was not haunted in the conventional sense of the word. He was finished, in the way that Sobieski described the four survey team members, as finished, but in reverse. He had seen what was there. He had decided not to pursue it. And he had spent the rest of his life managing the implications of that decision. The coat that Ren Asadorian found hanging in the deep chamber is the physical fact at the center of this story, the thing around which everything else arranges itself. A coat, folded neatly over a limestone boss in a chamber that hours of travel separate from the surface. A coat of the right age to have belonged to someone who entered that cave in the summer of 1904 and did not come back out. A coat folded in the way that someone folds a coat when they expect to return for it. Asadorian describes the chamber in which she found it as having a quality that she has tried to put into words in several different ways across the decade since she first visited it. In her field journal, she describes it as a place where the air does something she has not encountered in any other cave. In her conversation with Costello in 2011, she described it as a place where being aware feels different from how it feels anywhere else she has ever been. In a private email to a colleague that the colleague has shared with other researchers in this community, with Asadorian's eventual knowledge and grudging permission, she described it as a place where thinking about what is ahead of you and what is behind you feels meaningless in a way that is not frightening, but is very difficult to bring back to the surface world in any form that retains its original character. She has not been back to that chamber since her third field season. She has said, when asked, that she has not ruled out returning. She has also said that she understands, in a way she did not before she found the coat, why the pencil notation on the 1906 letter said what it said. There is a particular quality to this kind of research, this long, slow accumulation of careful observation around a central mystery that cannot be fully named, that I want to try to describe before we go further. Because I think understanding the quality of the research is as important as understanding its findings, and because the researchers in this story are worth more than just a summary of what they found. Constance Fallow was, by all accounts, a methodical and skeptical person. She did not come from a background of paranormal research or alternative history or any of the other frameworks that people sometimes apply to material like this. She came from administrative history, which is arguably the most prosaic corner of the historical discipline, a field devoted to understanding how paperwork systems work and how they fail. When she first encountered the one-sentence summary of the 1904 expedition in the Ottawa archive, her instinctive response was not that something mysterious had happened, but that something bureaucratic had happened. Someone had made a decision about the record. She wanted to know what the decision was and why it had been made. She spent 40 years chasing that question and did not, in any formal sense, ever answer it. She did not identify the official who made the decision to alter the record. She did not find the original field notes from the expedition. She did not find a complete account from any source of what the 7 people saw and did and experienced inside the cave. What she found, instead, was the outline of the answer, the shape it left in the documentary record, the negative space where the full account should have been, and she came to believe, toward the end of her life, that the negative space was itself a kind of documentation, that the specific pattern of absence she had identified, the specific things that had been removed or misfiled or never created, told you something important about what was being concealed, even if it did not tell you the concealed thing itself. She wrote, in her last published paper in 2017, at the age of 73, the effort required to maintain a documentary silence of this kind across a century and a half of archival reorganization, multiple changes of government, the digitization of historical records, and the work of at least a dozen independent researchers approaching the material from different directions, suggests that what is being protected is not an embarrassment or a policy failure or any of the ordinary things that governments conceal. Those things surface eventually. They always do. What does not surface, what requires this level of sustained effort to keep below the surface, is something that the people doing the concealing understood would be fundamentally destabilizing if it became common knowledge. Not embarrassing, destabilizing. She did not speculate in print about what that destabilizing thing might be. She had too much respect for evidentiary discipline to speculate in print. But she had been working on this question for 40 years, and she was not a naive person. And the fact that she used the word destabilizing rather than any of the other words she might have used tells you something about where her private thinking had arrived. Raymond Costello is more willing to speculate than Fallow was, which has cost him some credibility in certain academic contexts, and which he acknowledges without particular regret. He is a document historian by training, and his specialty is exactly this kind of thing, the study of what government records reveal about decisions that governments decided not to fully record. He has worked on suppressed documents in 4 countries, and is not, as he has noted more than once, easily surprised by what governments choose to conceal. But the 1904 Liard expedition has surprised him in ways that his other work has not. What surprises him is not the existence of the suppression. Governments suppress records about many things, and the suppression of information about a cave in northern Canada in 1904 would not, on its face, be especially notable. What surprises him is the durability of the suppression and the consistency of its application across a very long period. Government suppression of information in 1904 typically relied on a small number of officials with shared interests and on the natural entropy of a filing system that was slow, underfunded, and human. Records got lost, misfiled, destroyed accidentally. The conditions that favored suppression also favored accidental rediscovery. And yet, in the case of the 1904 expedition, the suppression has been remarkably effective for a remarkably long time. The documents that have surfaced have done so only through accidents and cross-referencing and patient archival work by researchers who were not looking for them directly. None of them surfaced through the kind of leak or inadvertent disclosure that is the most common route by which suppressed government records come to light. This suggests, to Costello, that the suppression has been actively maintained, not just allowed to persist, but periodically attended to. Someone, or some institutional process, has continued over more than a century to ensure that certain things stay in certain drawers, and certain files stay mislabeled, and certain routes of inquiry lead to dead ends. This is not, he is careful to say, a conspiracy in the dramatic sense of the word. It does not require a secret society or a shadowy cabal. It requires only that a small number of people in relevant positions, in each successive generation, understand what they are maintaining and why it should be maintained, and make the relatively modest effort required to maintain it. He has no proof of active maintenance. He has inference. The inference is strong enough that he includes it in his academic work because he believes that a historian's obligation is to go where the evidence points, even when the evidence points towards something that is difficult to characterize within normal evidentiary frameworks. Julian Harkness, the linguist who published the 2004 paper on Casca oral traditions, is perhaps the most circumspect of the core researchers in this story. He works in a field that requires him to treat indigenous knowledge systems with scrupulous care, and he is acutely aware of the history of researchers who have used indigenous knowledge as raw material for theories that serve the researchers' purposes without serving the communities whose knowledge is being used. He is not willing to say more than the oral tradition clearly says. He will not extrapolate. He will not argue from the Casca tradition that anything specific happened in that cave. He will say only what the tradition says, that the cave has been known for a very long time, that the restriction on entering it predates Casca presence in the region, and that the nature of the restriction is not about danger in the ordinary sense, but about a kind of permanent change that the oral tradition treats as both real and irreversible. But he said something in a conference presentation in 2009 that has stayed with the researchers who heard it. He was talking about the Casca phrase that describes what happens to people who go deep enough into the cave, the phrase that he translates as finished with the surface, and he was trying to give his audience a sense of the connotative range of the phrase in the original Casca, the range of meaning that a careful translation necessarily compresses. He said that the phrase was not primarily a phrase about direction, not about going down or going in. It was a phrase about orientation. It described a change in the orientation of a person's attention and understanding, a reorientation away from the concerns of surface life towards something else. And he said that the most important thing about the phrase, the thing that the oral tradition was most insistent about preserving, was that the reorientation was not experienced as a loss by the person undergoing it. It was experienced as a clarification, as a becoming clearer about something that had always been present but that surface life kept you from seeing. That is a very specific thing for an oral tradition to preserve across many generations. Oral traditions preserve what they preserve because the knowledge is important to the community that holds it. This knowledge, that the cave changes you, and that the change is experienced as clarification rather than loss, was apparently important enough to the people who established the restriction to encode it in the tradition alongside the restriction itself. They were not, whoever they were, trying to describe a terrible thing. They were trying to describe an accurate thing, a thing that was real and that had a particular character that the tradition wanted the people hearing it to understand correctly. The 4 members of the 1904 expedition who did not come back. The companion of Gideon Peele, who went deeper in 1906. Vera Sobieski's description of what had happened to them. The four went deeper because the deeper you go, the more you understand what you are looking at. These are three independent sources describing the same phenomenon in different registers of knowledge, and they are all describing something that is not loss and not tragedy and not death in the ordinary sense of the word. This is the aspect of the story that is hardest to carry back to the surface, because our frameworks for understanding disappearance and absence and things that happen to people in remote places are mostly frameworks of tragedy: the lost explorer, the accident victim, the person who could not survive the conditions. These frameworks are coherent, and they are useful, and they apply to the overwhelming majority of documented cases of disappearance in the historical record of northern exploration. They do not obviously apply here. What applies here is something that does not have a well-developed framework in the intellectual tradition of the Western academic disciplines that the researchers in this story work within. It is not accident, and it is not choice in the ordinary sense, and it is not death in the ordinary sense. It is something that the Kaska oral tradition has a word for, and that Vera Sobieski approached obliquely in her notebook, and that Ren Asadorian tried to describe, and found that her descriptions kept losing something essential on the way, from the cave to the surface world, finished with the surface. Let us talk about the physical interior of the cave, to the extent that the physical evidence allows us to. Asadorian's published geological papers describe a cave system whose main passage begins at an entrance that she has located and accessed. An entrance that she has confirmed corresponds to the description in the Kaska oral tradition preserved by Drury in 1938. The entrance is, as the elder described it, a place where the rock goes down at an angle, like a staircase placed into the hillside. It is not dramatic. If you were not looking for it, you could walk past it. The limestone around it is unremarkable northern plateau cast. The opening itself is wide but not tall, and the transition from daylight to shadow happens quickly once you move inside. The passage descends at a consistent angle for approximately 200 meters before leveling into what Asadorian describes as the first major chamber, a space roughly 30 meters wide and 15 meters high, with a ceiling that shows evidence of significant dissolution, and that is hung in places with formations that are consistent with standard limestone speleothems, but that include, in a cluster near the eastern wall, the anomalous crystal aggregates she has described in her published work without being able to explain their formation mechanism. She characterizes these formations in her field journal with more specificity than her published papers allow. She describes them as looking like something that grew toward a source of something that no longer exists there. She notes that they are oriented, all of them, in a consistent direction, pointing toward the deeper passage that continues south from the chamber. She notes that she does not know what would cause crystal aggregation to be directional in this way, because standard cave crystal formation is responsive to water source and gravity and the physical structure of the host rock, not to directions within the cave. She notes that she finds the directionality and the fact that whatever the crystals were growing toward is apparently no longer there, to be the most significant physical observation she made in her 3 field seasons. The passage continues south from the first chamber. The cairn marks that Asadorian identified as consistent with early 20th century survey technique begin in this passage, at approximately 50-meter intervals, continuing as far into the system as she has explored. This means that the 1,904 survey crew marked their route as they went deeper. They were following standard practice. They intended to be able to find their way back. The cairns continue past the chamber where Asadorian found the coat. They continue past every point she has reached in the system. She has not found the end of the cairn trail, and she has not found the end of the cave. She has set herself a protocol of not going deeper than a certain distance from her surface support camp in any single expedition, for safety reasons that she does not apologize for, and that limit means that her exploration of the system has been incremental and cautious. She has covered, across 3 field seasons, approximately 11 kilometers of the main passage. The passage continues ahead of her. The deepest point she has reached is a chamber that she describes, in her field journal, with a sentence that is one of the more extraordinary pieces of scientific observation I have encountered in the course of researching this story. She writes, "This chamber has an acoustic quality that I cannot explain, and that affects my perception in a way I am not comfortable reporting without more data." Then, in a different handwriting, apparently added later, she adds, "The more data does not resolve the problem. The quality persists, regardless of how carefully you try to account for it." What she will say about the acoustic quality, when pressed, is that sound in that chamber does not behave the way sound behaves in any other cave she has been in. She is not describing an echo effect or a resonance effect or any of the acoustic phenomena that caves typically produce. She is describing something about the relationship between the sounds you make and the sounds you hear, between what you intend to produce and what actually happens in the air around you. She will not say more than that, and she has asked the researchers who know about this detail to treat it with the same caution she applies to it herself. There is a final piece of evidence I want to describe before we talk about where this research currently stands. It comes not from archives or geological fieldwork or oral tradition, but from the most unexpected of sources. A private memoir written by one of the confirmed survivors of the 1904 expedition. William Crace, the chainman who was one of the two survivors Fallow identified with confidence, died in 1939. He was 66 years old. He had, after returning from the expedition, worked for a few more years as a survey hand in southern Alberta, then left survey work entirely and spent the rest of his working life as a janitor at a school in Medicine Hat. He never married. He lived alone. He did not, by any account that Fallow could find, maintain social relationships of any depth. After his death, the contents of his room at a boarding house in Medicine Hat were sold at auction. Among those contents was a handwritten ledger, the kind of accounting ledger that would have been used for bookkeeping, which Crace had acquired and used for private writing rather than accounting. The ledger eventually ended up in an antique shop, then in a private collection, then, through the kind of slow accumulation of coincidences that characterizes this entire story, in the hands of a dealer in historical documents who in 2006 reached out to Costello, who had by then become the most publicly visible researcher working on the 1904 expedition. The ledger was full, every page covered in Crace's handwriting, written over a period that the dating evidence in the text suggests spanned roughly 30 years. Most of it was ordinary. Daily observations, weather notes, grocery lists, the kind of private notation that people use to organize their inner lives when they have no one to talk to. But interspersed throughout, beginning in the section that Costello estimates corresponds to the mid-1910s, were passages that addressed what had happened in the cave. Crace never named the cave. He never named the expedition. He referred to the event as what happened in the rock, and he referred to his fellow survivors as the woman and the other man, never by name. He referred to the four who did not come back as the four who understood, which is a phrase that resonates with what Vera Sobieski wrote and with what the Kaska oral tradition preserves, in a way that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. But what Crace wrote about the four who understood is not what you might expect. He did not describe them as lost. He did not describe them as victims of accident or misadventure. He did not describe them as people who had been taken from the world against their will. He described them as people who had arrived somewhere that he and the woman and the other man had seen from a distance and decided not to reach, and he described that decision, his decision and theirs, as something he was still not sure was the right one. He wrote, in an entry that Costello estimates dates to the 1930s, somewhere in the last decade of his life, "I have thought about it for 30 years, and I cannot tell you whether we were brave or cowardly. I know what we came back to. I do not know, and I have never known, what they went to. I suspect I will find out eventually, and I have been trying to decide for 30 years how I feel about that." We have reached the point in this story where I want to be honest with you about what we know and what we do not know, and where the boundary between the two sits. What we know, from documented sources that can be checked and verified, is this. A government survey team of 7 people entered a cave system in northern British Columbia in the summer of 1904. 4 of them did not come back out, and the Canadian government subsequently made a decision to remove the expedition from the documentary record and to prohibit any further survey operations in that area without specific high-level authorization. This is documented. It is in the archives. You can go find it. What we know from the convergence of multiple independent sources, each of which has its own evidentiary weight, is that the cave is real, that it is large, that it has been known to the peoples of that region for a very long time that there has been a sustained cultural prohibition on entering it for reasons that are described consistently across different knowledge systems as having to do with a kind of permanent reorientation of perception rather than with physical danger, and that the people who entered it in 1904 and in 1906, and who travelled deep enough into it, behaved afterward in ways that are consistent with this description. This convergence does not prove anything in the strict evidentiary sense, but it is a very specific pattern pointing in a very consistent direction. What we do not know is what is in the cave that produces this effect. We do not know the mechanism. We do not know whether the 4 members of the 1904 expedition are, in any sense of the word, still there. We do not know what Ren Asadurian was hearing in the deep chamber that she described as affecting her perception in a way she was not comfortable reporting without more data. We do not know whose handwriting the pencil notation on the 1906 letter was in, or what that person knew that made them write those 4 words, instead of simply filing the letter. We do not know why Gideon Peel spent 40 years as a bookkeeper in Hamilton. We do not know what Vera Sobieski was thinking about when she wrote that accuracy is the only thing she had left that felt like something she was actually holding. These are the genuine mysteries at the center of this story, and I want to sit with them for a moment rather than rushing past them into speculation, because I think the mysteries themselves are the most honest account of where things stand. Now, there is more to the physical story of the cave and the surrounding landscape, and I want to go through it carefully, because the physical evidence is the most concrete basis we have for understanding what might be in there. The limestone of the Liard Plateau is, as Asadorian has documented, Devonian in age, approximately 380 million years old. Devonian limestone formations around the world are associated with some of the oldest cave systems on Earth, simply because of the time that water has had to work on them. But Devonian limestone of this particular composition and in this particular tectonic setting has a secondary characteristic that Asadorian has written about in a 2009 paper on Canadian paleokarstic environments. It contains, preserved within its structure, the remnants of a reef ecosystem that existed in that ancient shallow sea. Corals, stromatoporoids, crinoids, sponges, the skeletal remains of marine organisms from a world that no longer exists. These remnants are not fossils in the sense that most people think of fossils, discrete bones or shells replaced by mineralized material. They are the original reef structure, the calcium carbonate framework that those organisms built, preserved in 3 dimensions within the rock. What this means for the cave's interior is that the walls of the passages and chambers, in certain zones, are made of actual ancient reef. The structure of the rock is the structure of the living reef that occupied this space 380 million years ago. The cave passages follow the lines of weakness in that structure, the boundaries between reef structures, the spaces between ancient coral heads, and the acoustic behavior of such a space, as Asadorian has noted in print, is different from the acoustic behavior of a cave carved through homogeneous limestone because the internal structure of the rock is heterogeneous and complex in a way that affects how sound propagates and reflects. This is a geological explanation for something unusual. It is not a complete explanation for what Asadorian described in her field journal, because she is a scientist who has worked in many caves with unusual acoustic properties, and she did not describe this one as merely unusual. She described it as something she could not account for, and that affected her perception. But it is a starting point for a physical understanding, and it is worth having. The deeper question, the one that the physical understanding does not resolve, is what about this particular cave? This particular depth of limestone, this particular place in the plateau, makes it the place where the stone speaks in a way that the Casca oral tradition has preserved across many generations, as categorically different from any other feature of the landscape. The Casca and their predecessors in this territory were sophisticated readers of landscape, the entire body of traditional ecological knowledge that Harkness worked with for 15 years. Is testimony to a deep understanding of the land that the Casca have occupied, an understanding built through generations of careful observation and practical engagement. They did not preserve arbitrary restrictions. They preserved restrictions that mattered, that had a basis in observed reality. The restriction on entering the cave was encoded in tradition, alongside specific descriptions of what happened to people who entered it. descriptions that are internally consistent and that match, in their broad outlines, what the documentary record from 1904 says about what happened to the people who entered it. This consistency is what makes the story worth taking seriously beyond its narrative interest. It is not just a compelling historical mystery, it is a pattern of convergence across very different knowledge systems, pointing at the same observed phenomenon. What that phenomenon is, what its mechanism is, whether it is something that our current understanding of physics and biology and consciousness can accommodate, or whether it requires frameworks we have not yet developed, these are genuine open questions. And the appropriate response to genuine open questions is not to close them prematurely with either a dismissive explanation or a dramatic one. William Crace, working as a janitor in Medicine Hat for 30 years after the cave, was not haunted in any dramatic sense. He went to work, he came home, he wrote in his ledger. He thought, for 30 years, about whether he had been brave or cowardly. That is not the behavior of a person who experienced something terrifying. It is the behavior of a person who experienced something that resisted the ordinary categories of experience, and who spent the rest of his life trying to locate it within those categories without quite succeeding. That is actually the most precise description we have of what the cave does to the people who get close enough to understand what they are looking at. Raymond Costello has continued to research this question, and has in the last decade begun to focus his attention on the institutional history of the suppression itself, specifically on trying to understand not just what was suppressed and how, but why the specific level of authority involved chose to involve itself. The 1906 letter from the Deputy Minister's office is a document at a high level of the federal bureaucracy. It is not unusual for deputy ministers to be involved in decisions about survey operations, but the specific framing of the instruction not merely to close the survey but to amend the record to reflect that the northern section of the drainage was not surveyed, is unusual. Amending a survey record is falsification of a government document. A deputy minister who ordered falsification of a government document was taking a significant risk. He would not take that risk for a routine policy decision. He would take it only for something he believed required it, something he believed would be more dangerous in the record than out of it. Costello has tried to identify what briefing this deputy minister might have received. He has looked for any correspondence that would indicate how the information from the expedition reached the deputy minister's level in the first place. Since the expedition's field notes were never submitted, which means the normal reporting channel did not function, he has found only one partial answer, a single reference in a letter from the Land Office Register in Whitehorse, a reference to the fact that one of the 3 survivors requested a private meeting with the senior Dominion representative in Whitehorse territory before departing south. The meeting is not described. The attendees are not named beyond the Dominion representative, but a private meeting with the senior federal official in the territory, at the level at which that meeting would need to happen for information to travel up the chain to the deputy minister in Ottawa, suggests that at least one of the 3 survivors told someone in authority what they had seen, and that official had decided, within 2 years, that the record should not exist. There is one more thread in this story that I have not yet addressed, and it is the most recent one. It is also the one I am most cautious about, because it involves events that are recent enough that the people involved are still living, and that the evidentiary record is still forming. In 2018, a team of researchers from a Canadian university applied to the relevant provincial and federal authorities for a permit to conduct a geological survey of the area containing the cave system. The permit was denied. The reasons given were standard regulatory language about protected areas and habitat sensitivity. The area in question is inside a provincial park designation. Permits for geological research inside the park are routinely granted to researchers with appropriate credentials and methodology. The university team had both. The denial was unusual. They appealed. The appeal was denied at a higher administrative level. They applied under a different regulatory pathway. That application was also denied at a speed that their academic advisor described in a letter to colleagues as unprecedented in his 30 years of working with federal environmental review processes. Ren Asadorian was not part of this team and was not involved in their permit applications. She had conducted her own fieldwork through a different regulatory arrangement that predated the recent wave of applications and that appears to have been structured in a way that did not trigger the same review process. She has not been formally prohibited from continuing her work. She has, however, noted that the regulatory environment around the plateau has changed in the last 5 years in ways that are not consistent with the general direction of federal policy toward increased scientific access to protected areas. She continues to plan a return to the deep chamber. She has not yet gone back. She has said, in a 2022 interview with a Canadian science journalist, that she is not avoiding it. She is preparing for it with the same care she would apply to any technically demanding cave exploration, and care takes time, and she would rather take more time than she needs than less. She did not, in that interview, say anything about the coat or the acoustic chamber or the aspects of her field observations that appear only in the journals and not in the published papers. The journalist had not asked about those things. The journalist did not know about those things. She answered only what was asked, with the precision that is characteristic of her work. And then the interview ended. The research continues. It has continued for more than 40 years since Constance Fallow first noticed that one sentence sitting in a manila folder in the Ottawa archive. The cave has been in that plateau for 380 million years. It has been known to the peoples of that region for as long as anyone can document human presence there. The Kaska oral tradition says that the restriction against entering it was established before the Kaska came to the region, which means before approximately 1,000 years ago, by the best current archaeological estimates of their presence in that territory. And what the tradition says about why the restriction exists has not changed across all those generations. The cave changes you. The change is permanent. The change is not experienced as loss. 4 men who were part of a government survey team in the summer of 1904 found out what that means, in a limestone cave in northern Canada, in a passage that goes somewhere that their surveyors' cairns mark all the way down into the dark. Somewhere ahead of the cairns, past the coat on the limestone boss, past the chamber where sound does not behave the way sound behaves anywhere else in the world that Ren Asadorian has been. Somewhere in the part of the cave that no one currently alive has reached. Something is there that has been there long enough to be named in languages older than any recorded history in this hemisphere, and to generate a caution so serious that a deputy minister of the Canadian government thought it worth falsifying a federal record to keep people away from it. That is what we know. That is what the evidence says. The 4 went deeper, because the deeper you go, the more you understand what you are looking at. Vera Sobieski wrote that in January of 1905, in Whitehorse, 6 months after she had stood at the threshold of something and stepped back. She was 27 years old. She spent the next 30 years of her life doing ordinary things. She moved to Manitoba. She worked for a time at the Provincial Museum. She married in 1912 and had 2 children. Her family remembers her as a warm and capable person who was good at paying attention to things, who could describe a plant or an animal or a piece of landscape with a precision that stuck with you. They remember her as someone who seemed always to know where she was, in the physical sense, as if her spatial awareness was finely calibrated in a way that other people's were not. She died in 1941, 37 years after the cave. In her last winter, she went back to the habit of keeping a notebook that she had apparently abandoned sometime after 1905. The last entry in that final notebook, written in the months before she died, was found by her daughter among her papers and was shared with Constance Fallow in 1994, and Fallow included it, with the family's permission, in her 2003 paper on the Sobieski notebook. The entry read, "I have been thinking about the 4 of them again, which I do more often now. I used to think that what I felt about them was something like grief, because they were gone and I was not. But I do not think that is what it is anymore. I think it is something more like the feeling you have when you leave a room where something important was happening, and you know the important thing will keep happening after you leave, and you wonder sometimes what it has become in all the time since you closed the door behind you." That is Vera Sobieski's last word on the matter, not grief, not fear. Something more like wondering, from a comfortable distance, about what she did not stay to find out. The cave is still there. The cairns are still there. The coat is still hanging on the limestone boss in the deep chamber. The passage continues past it into something that Ren Asadorian's current instruments and protocols have not yet reached. The karst plateau spreads across 12,000 square kilometers of northwestern British Columbia. The limestone beneath it is 380 million years old. The oral tradition that has been keeping this knowledge alive for longer than any written record in this hemisphere describes what is inside it with a word that means finished with the surface. Whatever is happening in that cave has been happening for a very long time. The people who went in 1904 and did not come back were the latest in a much longer line of people who encountered it and arrived at the same decision. And the 3 people who came back from it in 1904 spent the rest of their lives with the particular quality of knowing they had been close to something and had chosen not to follow it, a choice that none of them, in what they left behind in the way of private writing, described as simple. I want to close with something that I think matters. This story does not have a resolution. There is no final revelation, no discovered document that explains everything, no official acknowledgement from any government. The archive is still incomplete. The cave is still unexplored past a certain depth. The people who were closest to what happened in 1904 have all been dead for decades. The researchers who have worked on this question for decades are working with fragments and patterns and inferences, doing what historians and scientists do when they encounter something at the edge of what the current record can illuminate. But the fragments fit together in a way that is worth paying attention to. The Casca oral tradition, and the government suppression, and the private notebooks, and the coat on the limestone boss, and the acoustic chamber that does something that one of the world's most experienced cave geologists cannot account for. These are not random pieces. They are pieces of something. What they are pieces of, I do not know. What Ren Asadurian heard in that chamber, I do not know. What William Crace meant when he wrote that he suspected he would find out eventually how he felt about his decision, I do not know. But the limestone will be there when anyone is ready to look. The cairns go all the way down. Somewhere past the farthest point anyone has mapped, the passage continues into a part of the earth that has been described, across more generations than we can count, as a place where you become clearer about something that was always there, but that living on the surface keeps you from seeing. The question of whether that is something to seek or something to avoid has been answered differently by different people across a very long span of time. 4 people answered it one way in the summer of 1904. 3 answered it another way. Gideon Peele answered it twice, differently each time. Vera Sobieski answered it, and then spent 37 years wondering about the answering. None of them, in what they left behind, described what they found as something that should not have been there. They described it as something they were not ready for, or not willing for, or not able to fully accommodate in the life they had above the rock. That is the honest shape of this mystery, as the evidence presents it. Not a horror, not a danger in the way that a falling rock is a danger. Something stranger and more patient than that. Something that has been in the limestone for 380 million years and has not been in any hurry. The Liard Plateau sits in its corner of northwestern British Columbia. The cave goes down. The cairns go all the way to the coat, and then farther. And somewhere in the deep system, past everything that the current research has reached, the passage continues into whatever the 4 who went deeper in 1904 found at the end of it. If you have been listening to this, and you are starting to feel that familiar pull towards sleep, toward the slow letting go of the surface world, and its concerns, and its measurements, and its documented records, that is exactly what these videos are for. The long reach back into the strange and careful past. The patient following of threads that do not resolve into clean answers. The willingness to sit with a mystery at the edge of what we know and to feel, rather than to explain, what it is that the mystery is pointing toward. Maybe subscribe if you have not yet, and tell me in the comments where you are tonight. Your city, your country, the time where you are, the landscape outside your window if there is one. The cave in northern Canada has been keeping its secret for much longer than we have been asking questions. Somewhere, in that limestone, the story continues without us. Here on the surface, we can only follow the documents as far as they go, and then sit with what remains when the documents end. Which is, if you think about it, a very old and very human thing to do. William Crace, janitor in Medicine Hat, writing in his ledger by the light of a single lamp, wondering for 30 years about what the 4 who went deeper found, and whether he had been brave or cowardly when he decided not to find out. Constance Fallow in an Ottawa archive in 1977, noticing a single sentence where a full report should have been, and writing in her margin. 4 men do not vanish from a survey record without someone deciding that is what should happen. Gideon Peel at the rail camp in 1904, watching 3 people come in from the bush and not talk, and seeing in their silence the shape of something he could not name yet, and deciding, 2 years later, to go back and look. The cave in the limestone, the cairns in the dark, the coat on the boss in the deep chamber, folded the way you fold something when you mean to come back for it. The passage ahead, still going. Rest well tonight, wherever you are. I want to go back to the beginning of this mystery in a different way, because I think the story of what the 1904 expedition found inside that cave is also, unavoidably, a story about the land itself, and about the way land holds memory in ways that are not metaphorical but physical, geological, actual. The limestone of the Liard Plateau is not just a rock formation, it is a record. And understanding what kind of record it is, and what it records, gives you a different relationship to everything else in this story. 380 million years ago, the land that is now northwestern British Columbia sat near the equator. The planet was warmer, the sea levels were higher, and the particular region that would eventually become the Liard Plateau was a shallow tropical sea, no more than 100 meters deep in most places, warm and clear and rich with life. Reefs grew there, enormous structures built by the collaborative labor of millions of coral polyps and sponges, and crinoids and stromatoporoids, organisms so ancient that they predate the forests of the planet, predate the dinosaurs, predate almost everything that we think of as characterizing life on Earth. These reef organisms built their structures from calcium carbonate, extracted from the seawater around them, the same mineral that limestone is made of, and when they died, their structures did not dissolve. They accumulated, layer on layer, and eventually the sheer weight of the accumulation compressed the lower layers into rock. Not into a featureless rock, but into a rock that preserved the internal architecture of the reef, the branching structures of coral colonies, the layered mats of ancient algae, the intricate geometries of organisms we have no modern equivalent for and can only partially reconstruct from what the rock holds. Then the continents moved. The land that held this ancient sea floor was pushed northward by the slow grinding of tectonic plates, was folded and buckled by collision, was lifted and worn and glaciated and re-lifted over hundreds of millions of years, until it occupied the position it now holds in the northwest corner of British Columbia, thousands of kilometers from the equator and hundreds of meters above the sea level at which the reef had grown. The rock came with it. The reef structure came with it. The 3-dimensional record of a tropical sea from 380 million years ago came with it, carried north and upward in the limestone of the Liard Plateau. Water found it. Water always finds limestone. Rain falls, absorbs carbon dioxide from the air, becomes slightly acidic, and dissolves calcium carbonate, slowly, a molecule at a time, over millions of years. The water follows the internal architecture of the rock, the lines of weakness between ancient coral structures, the boundaries between different kinds of reef organisms, the fracture zones created by the mountain-building forces that moved the rock from equator to subarctic. It carves out spaces. It creates passages and chambers along the lines that the ancient reef established 380 million years ago. The cave follows the reef. The cave is, in a real sense, the negative image of the reef, the space where the reef was and is no longer. This is what Ren Asadorian means when she writes in her field journal that the walls of the deep passages are made of actual ancient reef. She is not speaking loosely. She is describing the physical reality of what she is moving through, the preserved skeletal structure of a marine ecosystem from a world so different from our own that imagining it requires a fundamental revision of every assumption you carry about the landscape around you. The passages of the cave trace the boundaries between ancient coral heads. The chambers open where the reef was most porous. The acoustic behavior of the deep system is shaped by the internal geometry of organisms that have not existed for hundreds of millions of years. And somewhere in that ancient geometry, in the spaces carved out of the bones of the ancient sea, something has been doing what it has been doing for a very long time. Long enough for the Casca oral tradition to encode the knowledge of it. Long enough for people who predated the Casca in this territory to establish the restriction on entering the cave, and to make sure that the restriction was passed forward in a form that preserved the specific character of what the cave does to people who go deep enough. Long enough for the restriction to outlast the people who established it, to survive the many generations of human presence in the territory, to arrive intact in the 21st century in a form that a careful linguist can still recognize and characterize. 380 million years is a number that is actually difficult to hold in the mind. The human nervous system did not evolve to process time at that scale. We can write the number, we can say the words. But experiencing what it means, having an intuitive relationship with what 380 million years of continuous physical process looks like, is beyond the capacity of any human consciousness. What we can do, and what the researchers in this story have done, is pay attention to what the record in the rock is saying, and try to understand what it means for the question we are actually asking. What is in that cave? And what has it been for long enough that the people of that territory found it necessary to preserve the knowledge of it across more generations than we can count? I want to talk about a specific document that Raymond Costello found in 2014, because it is the most recent significant archival discovery in this research, and because it changes something about the framing of the question in a way that I think is important. The document is a memorandum typed on the letterhead of the Canadian Geological Survey, dated 1932. It is addressed from one geologist to another, both of them working within the survey's Northern Exploration Program. The sender's name is Elliot Ray, the recipient's name is Thomas Garfield. Costello found it in the personal papers of a geologist who had worked for the survey in the 1940s and 1950s, papers that had been donated to a university library by the geologist's family after his death, and that included a substantial amount of correspondence that the geologist had collected during his career. That was not his own correspondence, but material from the survey's files that he had apparently copied or obtained. Unofficially, the memorandum is about the Liard Plateau. Elliot Ray is writing to Thomas Garfield about a survey Ray had conducted in the Plateau region in the summer of 1931. The survey was a geological reconnaissance, not a cave survey, but in the course of doing geological work in the area, Ray had encountered the cave entrance. He had not entered it. He had documented it in his field notes and had written to Garfield, who was his supervisor, to ask how to handle the documentation in his final report. The memorandum that Costello found is Garfield's reply, and what Garfield's reply says is, in Costello's assessment, one of the most significant documents in the entire research history, because it indicates that by 1932, the knowledge of what had happened in 1904 had been actively maintained within a specific institutional context across 28 years. Garfield's reply instructs Ray not to document the cave entrance in his final survey report. He says this directly and without apparent discomfort. He also says, "You will find, if you search the relevant records, that the survey has a standing instruction regarding this feature dating from 1906. I was made aware of this instruction when I began in this division, and I am passing it to you now as it was passed to me. The instruction is to document nothing about this feature and to refer any inadvertent documentation to this office for handling. The reasons for this instruction are not ones I am in a position to share in correspondence, but they are sufficient. The reasons for this instruction are not ones I am in a position to share in correspondence, but they are sufficient." Garfield knew. In 1932, working for the Canadian Geological Survey, Thomas Garfield knew what was in that cave, or knew enough about what was in it to be willing to maintain an institutional instruction against documenting it without knowing all the details. The instruction had been passed to him when he began in his division, which means it had been passed down through the survey's hierarchy since at least 1906. Someone had made sure that each new person who took Garfield's job understood that this particular feature in the Liard Plateau was not to be documented, and why documenting it was not appropriate, without necessarily sharing all the details of what had happened in 1904. This is a very specific kind of institutional knowledge. It is not the kind of knowledge that lives in a file that anyone with appropriate clearance can access. It is the kind of knowledge that is passed person to person within a professional context, in the way that senior members of an institution pass particular kinds of understanding to their successors, not in writing, but in conversation. It is durable precisely because it does not live in the documentary record. It is sustainable precisely because it only requires that each person who holds it understands enough to maintain it and passes enough of it to their successors to ensure the maintenance continues. The reason I find this significant is that it changes the character of the suppression from something that was done in 1906 and then simply maintained by institutional inertia to something that has been actively reproduced across generations of people who understood, at least partially, what they were maintaining and why. This is not a cover-up in the sense that a cover-up is usually understood. It is more like a custody arrangement. Someone decided in 1906 that the cave's existence and the events of 1904 should not be in the public record, and then a series of subsequent people, each knowing enough to understand the importance of the arrangement, kept it. The question of who they were protecting is not one the documents answer directly. The 1906 letter from the Deputy Minister's office ordered the amendment of the record. Garfield's 1932 memorandum indicates that the knowledge had been maintained within the Geological Survey. The permit denials in 2018 and 2019 indicate that something in the current regulatory structure treats this particular piece of landscape as requiring special protection. At every point, the action is protective rather than aggressive. No one has attempted to stop the research that Fallow and Hebb and Costello and Asadorian have been doing. They have been allowed to find what they found in the archives, allowed to publish what they found, allowed to go to the plateau and do their geological work. What has been consistently prevented is the kind of official, large-scale, fully documented formal survey that would create a comprehensive public record. The difference between informal private research and formal public documentation is the difference between a thing that exists and a thing that is acknowledged to exist. The cave exists. The events of 1904 exist in the archival fragments that the researchers have assembled. What has been consistently prevented is the acknowledgement, the formal institutional recognition that would make all of this part of the official story of Canada's geological and historical record. Someone decided, in 1906, that acknowledgement was not appropriate, and that decision has been maintained across more than a century, not because the maintaining institutions are malevolent, but because the people who have held the knowledge have believed, generation after generation, that the reasons for the original decision were, as Garfield wrote in 1932, sufficient. Let us think carefully about what kind of reason would be sufficient. A government official who ordered the falsification of a survey record in 1906 was taking a personal, professional risk. He would not take that risk for a minor political embarrassment or a policy dispute or even a significant scandal. He would take it for something he believed was serious enough that the risk of exposure was preferable to the risk of what would happen if the information became public. What kind of information about a cave in northern Canada in 1904 could a senior federal official believe was serious enough to falsify a government document? Costello has thought about this question for more than 20 years. He has proposed several frameworks, none of which he believes is complete. The first framework is the simplest. The official was protecting the government from liability for the deaths or disappearances, or whatever the precise status of the 4 missing men was, by removing the evidence that they had been in the cave at all. This is a familiar kind of suppression, and there are many documented historical examples of it. But Costello does not find it fully convincing in this case, because the level of suppression is disproportionate to what liability protection would have required. Removing 4 names from a personnel record and filing a 1-sentence summary of the expedition would have been sufficient to avoid liability. The broader suppression, the standing instruction passed through the Geological Survey, the specific prohibition on any further survey operations without high-level authorization, suggests something beyond liability protection. The second framework is more complex. The official received a report from one or more of the survivors, or from the Whitehorse territorial representative who met with the survivors, that described what the cave did to the people who went deep enough, and decided that the public availability of this knowledge was itself a problem. In this framework, the suppression was not about concealing deaths, but about controlling access to the cave. The official believed that if people knew the cave existed and knew what was in it, some of them would want to go there, and that the consequences of large numbers of people attempting to access the cave would be worse than the consequences of keeping the information out of the official record. This framework has the advantage of explaining the sustained, generation-spanning nature of the suppression. If the goal was simply liability protection, the need for the suppression would diminish over time as the relevant individuals died and the immediate legal exposure passed. But if the goal was to prevent access, the need for the suppression would be permanent, or as permanent as the cave's existence, because the cave's capacity to do what it does to people who go deep enough would not diminish over time. The third framework is the one that Costello finds most compelling, and that he is most cautious about stating plainly. It is that the official who ordered the suppression in 1906 understood something about what the cave was that went beyond what a standard liability assessment or an access control decision would require. Something about the nature of what was in the cave that he believed was simply not ready to be part of the public understanding of the world. Not dangerous in the way that a physical hazard is dangerous. Not embarrassing in the way that a policy failure is embarrassing. But destabilizing in the way that Constance Fallow used the word. Something that, if widely known, would change the way people understood their situation in the world in a way that the official did not believe society was prepared for. Costello does not know what that something was. He suspects that the official who ordered the suppression in 1906 did not fully know either. What he appears to have known was that 4 competent, experienced men had gone into a cave and had not come out, that they had gone deeper, because the deeper you go, the more you understand what you are looking at, that this was not an accident and not a tragedy in any ordinary sense, and that the 3 people who came back had been changed by their proximity to whatever was in there in ways that were not obviously reversible. And he had decided, on the basis of that knowledge, that the world was not ready. There is something worth sitting with in that decision. A senior government official in 1906, working with the information he had, made a judgment that what was in that cave was not something that the public could receive and process and accommodate without consequences that he was not willing to be responsible for. We can critique that judgment. We can argue that decisions about what the public can handle are not properly the province of senior bureaucrats. We can note that the suppression has failed in the sense that the information has surfaced anyway through the patient work of researchers who were not stopped from doing their research, only from making it official. But we can also sit with the fact that the judgment was made by someone who had more direct information about what had happened than any subsequent researcher has had access to. He heard, in some form, the accounts of people who had been close enough to the deep system to understand the nature of what was there. He believed what they told him, and he believed it was serious enough to falsify a federal document. That is a specific and considered act by a specific person with specific knowledge. Whatever we think of the decision, we should take the person and the knowledge seriously. The cave is still there. The research continues. Ren Asadourian is still planning a return to the deep chamber. The limestone has been doing whatever it has been doing for 380 million years, and is not, apparently, in any hurry to stop. What the cave is doing is the question. What has been in the Devonian limestone of the Liard Plateau, in the passages carved through ancient reef structure, in the chambers where the air behaves differently and the crystal formations grow towards something that is no longer there? That is the question that all of this research orbits without fully reaching. The Kaska oral tradition says, finished with the surface. Vera Sobieski said, the 4 went deeper, because the deeper you go, the more you understand what you are looking at. William Crace said, I have thought about it for 30 years, and I cannot tell you whether we were brave or cowardly. Ren Asadourian said, this chamber has an acoustic quality that I cannot explain, and that affects my perception in a way I am not comfortable reporting without more data. Thomas Garfield said, in 1932, the reasons for this instruction are not ones I am in a position to share in correspondence, but they are sufficient. These are people speaking from different positions, with different information, across more than a century. None of them is telling the same story. All of them are pointing at the same thing. The limestone holds its record for 380 million years. The cave holds whatever it holds. The cairns go all the way down. I want to go back to Gideon Peele, because I think his story is the one that sits closest to the human center of this mystery, and because the arc of his life is, in its quiet way, more affecting than any of the more dramatic details in the research record. Peele was 31 in 1904, when he was working as a timber cruiser at the Liard Rail Camp, which means he was born around 1873, probably in Ontario, and had come to the northern interior sometime in his mid-20s. Timber cruisers were skilled tradespeople who estimated the volume and quality of merchantable timber in advance of logging operations. The work required good spatial reasoning, physical endurance, and the capacity for careful, sustained attention in difficult terrain. Peel had been doing this work for about 5 years when he watched 3 survey team members walk in from the bush and sit by the stove for 2 days. What he saw in those 3 people is what put him on the trajectory that defined the rest of his life. He saw something in them that his letter to Dunmire does not try to name, because names were not adequate for it, but that he recognized as significant in a way that he could not ignore. They were not distressed. They were not in shock. They were not injured or sick or traumatized in any way that corresponded to what he knew about trauma from his years of working in remote and difficult environments. They were something else, something that his 5 years of bush experience did not have a category for, and the absence of a category was itself significant. He had seen men come back from bad situations. He had seen men come back from very bad situations. He knew what those men looked like. These 3 did not look like that. They looked, as near as he could describe in his letter, like people who had been somewhere that had nothing to do with disaster and had come back not because something had gone wrong, but because something had gone right in a way that left them without a clear next step. This is an unusual observation for a timber cruiser to make in 1904. Peel was not a philosopher or a poet or any kind of person whose temperament would have inclined him toward this kind of observation as a default mode of perception. He was a practical working man in a practical working trade. The fact that he made this observation suggests that what he saw in the 3 survivors was clear enough that even a person who was not looking for it could not miss it. And then he did something that, in retrospect, tells you a great deal about who he was. He thought about what he had seen for 2 years, and then he went back. Going back to the Liard Plateau in 1906 was not a casual decision. It was a remote and expensive journey. He was not a wealthy man. He would have had to save for it, plan for it, find a companion willing to share the difficulty and expense of a month-long backcountry expedition into terrain that most people had no reason to go to. He would have had to have a reason strong enough to justify all of that, and the only reason he could have had was the thing he had seen in the 3 survivors and had not been able to stop thinking about for 2 years. What did he expect to find? We cannot know. He might have expected to find an ordinary cave that the 1904 expedition had been in, and from which 4 men had died by accident. He might have expected to find something unusual but explicable. He might have expected to find something that would resolve the question of why 3 ordinary-looking men had come out of the bush looking like that, and to find that the resolution was disappointing was just a tragic accident in a remote place. What he found, instead, was whatever was in the cave, and then his companion found it, and then Peel came south alone and never went back. The companion's disappearance is the most significant thing about the 1906 trip, because it establishes that what had happened to the 4 members of the 1904 survey crew was not specific to that particular group of people, or to that particular summer, or to any circumstance of the 1904 expedition. Specifically, it was, apparently, a reliable feature of the cave. People who went in and went deep enough made the same decision, or had the same thing happen to them, across different years, different individuals, different contexts. The cave was consistent. And Peel, who had now seen this happen to a companion whose choice of going deeper he had not been able to prevent, made the decision not to go after him. He stood at the boundary of whatever was in that cave and decided to come back to the surface. And then he went to Hamilton and worked as a bookkeeper until he retired. He did not write about this decision in any document Fallow could find. He did not leave an explanation. But the choice of occupation, after the choice of not going deeper, is itself a kind of explanation. Bookkeeping is a profession of precise accounting, of making sure that what is on one side of the ledger corresponds exactly to what is on the other side. It is a profession that gives you, every day, the small satisfaction of finding that things balance, that the numbers on the left equal the numbers on the right, that the world of the records corresponds to the world of the facts. It is a deeply surface-oriented profession, in the sense of the Kaska oral tradition's use of that word. It is the work of someone who is committed to the surface, I do not know if Peel chose it deliberately for that reason. I am not sure it matters whether he did. What matters is the shape of the choice. A man who had been to the edge of a cave in northern Canada and watched his companion not come back had, in some way that Peel's life bore witness to, committed himself to the project of staying on this side of things, of keeping track, of making sure the ledger balanced, of remaining, in the most practical and immediate sense, finished with the surface, but from the opposite direction, not released from it, but anchored to it, in the way that a person who has felt the pull of something deep makes sure to have a weight on their ankle. There is a tradition in some indigenous cultures of the subarctic of understanding certain kinds of landscape features, not as places, but as relationships. A river is not just a body of water moving in a direction, it is a relationship between the land and the precipitation and the rock and the seasons and the organisms that depend on it and the peoples who have been in relationship with it for generations. A cave is not just a hole in the ground, it is a relationship between the stone and the water and the time that has passed and the life that was there before and whatever is in there now. When the Kaska tradition says that the cave is the place where the stone speaks, it is using the language of relationship. The stone is doing something. The stone is in a relationship with whoever is listening. What Julian Harkness found, in 15 years of working with Kaska oral traditions, was that the restriction on entering the cave was not a prohibition against a dangerous place. It was a statement about a relationship that the community had decided not to enter. The relationship was available. The cave made it available. The Kaska chose, as a community, not to enter it, and they encoded that choice in a tradition that preserved not just the restriction, but the reason for it. Because entering the relationship changed you permanently, and the change was not reversible, and the community needed its members to remain members of the community. This is a different framing of the restriction from any of the ones that the Western research tradition had brought to it. Fallow and Costello and Asadorian had been thinking about the cave in terms of what was in it, what had happened to the people who entered it, what the government had decided to conceal. The Kaska tradition was thinking about it in terms of a relationship and a community's decision about whether to enter that relationship. The prohibition was not a warning about a hazard. It was a community decision about what kind of relationship was compatible with the life the community needed to live. From this framing, the 4 members of the 1,904 survey crew were not victims and not the dead. They were people who, in a situation where the choice presented itself, chose to enter the relationship. And the 3 who came back were people who chose not to. And Gideon Peel, watching a companion make the same choice in 1906, chose not to follow him, and then spent 40 years as a bookkeeper in Hamilton, maintaining that choice in the most practical and immediate way available to him. This framing also illuminates the nature of the government suppression, because it allows us to see it not as a cover-up of a tragedy, but as a decision about access. If entering the cave offers people a relationship that changes them permanently, in a way that they experience as clarification rather than loss, then making the cave's existence widely known is, in effect, offering that relationship to everyone who hears about it. The official who ordered the suppression in 1906 was not primarily trying to hide an embarrassing incident. He was trying to control access to a relationship that he believed most people were not prepared for, and that the fabric of ordinary social and institutional life was not equipped to accommodate on a large scale. Whether he was right is a question I am not equipped to answer, but understanding the character of the decision helps make sense of why it has been maintained for so long, and why the maintaining institutions have allowed private research to proceed while preventing formal public documentation. Private researchers poking around in archives and writing academic papers about a cave in northern Canada do not create the kind of widespread public awareness that would make the relationship broadly accessible. Formal government acknowledgement of the cave's existence and the events of 1904 would. The maintaining institutions are not trying to prevent the truth from being known by a few careful people. They are trying to prevent the truth from being known by everyone. That is a different project, and it explains both the durability and the specific character of the suppression. Now, there is a question that this framing raises, and that I want to address directly, because I think avoiding it would be intellectually dishonest. The question is, what is the relationship? What is it that the cave offers, that the people who go deep enough enter, that changes them permanently in a way they experience as clarification rather than loss. What is on the other side of the threshold that the 4 members of the 1904 expedition crossed and did not come back from? The honest answer is that the research does not tell us, in any direct or specific way. The Kaska oral tradition characterizes the change without specifying its content. Vera Sobieski's notebook describes the decision of the 4 without describing what they found. William Crace's ledger expresses uncertainty about whether he was brave or cowardly without resolving what the alternative to his choice would have involved. Ren Asadurian describes the acoustic chamber without describing what the acoustic quality was doing to her perception in the specific ways she found unaccountable. What the research does tell us, in a consistent pattern across all of these sources, is the character of the change. It is not a change in the direction of destruction or dysfunction. It is a change in the direction of clarity, a becoming clearer about something, an understanding of what you are looking at that makes it difficult to want to return to a state of less understanding. It is described, in every register of knowledge that has touched this question, as something that people who reach it do not experience as bad, and that they do not, apparently, regret. The 4 who went deeper in 1904 and did not come back did not make a mistake. They made a choice. And the choice was, in some way that none of the available sources can fully describe, the right choice for them. Or at least the choice that felt right once they were in the position to make it. This is the aspect of the story that resists conventional narrative frameworks most completely. We do not have good frameworks for a disappearance that is not a tragedy. We do not have good frameworks for a permanent departure from ordinary life that is not death or madness or escape from something unbearable. We have frameworks for religious transformation, for the dramatic change that spiritual traditions describe as conversion or enlightenment or union with the divine. Some of those frameworks might apply here, in a loose analogical sense, but applying them requires being more confident about the nature of the change than the evidence actually supports. What the evidence supports is this: something in that cave produces, in people who go deep enough, a reorientation of perception and understanding that is permanent, that is not experienced as loss by the person undergoing it, and that is incompatible, in some way, with continued participation in ordinary surface life. That is what the evidence supports. What that thing is, what the mechanism is, what it means for the nature of consciousness or perception, or the relationship between the human nervous system and the physical world. These are questions that the evidence points toward without answering. The researchers in this story have been pointing at these questions for 40 years. They have been doing it carefully, with appropriate attention to the limits of what the evidence supports, with full awareness that the questions themselves are ones that our current intellectual frameworks are not equipped to fully accommodate. They have not resolved the questions, but they have established, with a reasonable degree of evidentiary rigor, that the questions are real. That is a significant achievement, and it is, in some ways, more honest than an answer would be. Raymond Costello, who has spent more than 2 decades on this, said something in a 2015 interview that I want to quote in full, because I think it captures something important about what this kind of research is and what it is worth. He said, "I am a document historian. My entire professional identity is built around the principle that the historical record contains the truth, that careful reading of documents will eventually produce an adequate account of what happened. And I have been working for 20 years on a question where the historical record has been deliberately deformed to prevent that from being true. The documents have been removed, altered, misfiled. The people who were closest to the events left only fragments, and the fragments have required extraordinary archival labor to find. And after 20 years, I have not produced an adequate account of what happened in that cave in 1904. I have produced an adequate account of the shape of the question. I know what the question is. I know some of the things it touches. I know that it is a real question and not an artifact of archival confusion, but I do not know the answer." And then he said, "I have been a historian my whole career. I have worked on a lot of questions. This is the only one I have worked on where I think not knowing the answer is itself an important piece of information about the nature of the thing being asked about. That is the most careful formulation I have heard of what I think is the deepest truth in this story. Not knowing the answer is itself an important piece of information. The cave does something to people who go deep enough that our current frameworks for understanding, experience, and knowledge and consciousness cannot accommodate. That is what the evidence says. And the appropriate response to evidence that your frameworks cannot accommodate is not to dismiss the evidence or to force it into a framework it does not fit, but to acknowledge that your frameworks may be incomplete. This is not comfortable. It is not the kind of thing that resolves cleanly into a story with a satisfying ending. It is the kind of thing that you sit with and keep coming back to, and find that it keeps being there when you come back to it, unchanged and patient and still pointing in the same direction. The Devonian limestone of the Liard Plateau holds the record of a reef that grew in a tropical sea 380 million years ago. The cave that water carved through that limestone holds whatever it holds. The cairns go from the entrance all the way down to a coat on a limestone boss and beyond it into a deep system that no one currently alive has fully explored. The acoustic chamber is there, at whatever depth Asadorian reached in her third field season, doing whatever it does to perception in a way that one of the world's most experienced cave geologists found unaccountable. And the question of what is there, what has been there long enough to have a name in the Casca oral tradition and a standing institutional instruction in the Canadian Geological Survey, and a coat in a chamber that took hours to reach in 1904 and is still hanging. There, over 100 years later, is still open. The cairns go all the way down. The passage continues past the last cairn that anyone has documented. Whatever is at the end of it has been there long enough to outlast every attempt to keep it out of the record, and it has been there long enough to wait. I want to describe the landscape around the cave entrance, as Asadorian describes it in her published papers and field journals, because I think the physical description grounds something that can otherwise feel too abstract, and because the specific quality of that landscape tells you something important about why the cave entrance is where it is, and why the people who did not know what they were looking for could easily have walked past it. The plateau is not dramatic terrain. That is the first thing to understand. It is not the kind of landscape that announces itself. There are no spectacular cliff faces, no obvious features that would draw a traveller's eye to a specific spot and say, "Here, this is the significant place." The plateau is a rolling limestone upland, mostly above the tree line in late summer, covered with low shrub vegetation and the scattered ponds and depressions that karst terrain produces, where the underground drainage has caused the surface to subside. The colour palette is muted: grey limestone, rust-coloured lichen, olive-green dwarf willow, the pale blue of shallow ponds. The sky above it in late summer is enormous and often cloudless, and the light has a quality that northern light has, a clarity and a sideways angle that makes the terrain feel simultaneously very close and very far. The cave entrance sits in a fold of the plateau, a low place between two higher ridges where the bedrock is exposed through the shallow soil cover. It does not look like a cave entrance. It looks like a place where the rock has tilted slightly, creating a surface of limestone that angles downward at perhaps 20 degrees from horizontal. The opening is along the lower edge of this tilted surface, where the rock simply ends and the space below it begins. Asadorian describes it as looking, from a distance of 20 meters, like a shadow, just a shadow at the base of a rock face. The shadow is the opening, and the opening is more than large enough to walk into. She describes the first few meters inside the entrance as a transition zone, the kind of space that caves always have, where the temperature drops from the outside air to the stable temperature of the cave interior, where the light changes from direct to reflected to none, where the humidity rises and the sound quality shifts from the open acoustic of the outdoors to the close, slightly reverberant quality of enclosed rock. The transition in this cave takes about 30 meters. Past that point, you are in the cave proper, and the outside world has become a concept rather than an environment. The passage slopes downward at a moderate angle for the next 170 meters before the first chamber opens. Asadorian has walked this section many times and describes it as uncomplicated by the standards of cave exploration, a consistent passage in sound rock with no serious technical obstacles. The floor is smooth limestone, worn by the ancient water that carved it. The walls are close enough to touch on both sides simultaneously if you stretch your arms. The ceiling is above head height, but not dramatically so. A person walking through this passage with a headlamp is moving through a space that is tight but not confined, that asks for attention but not for any unusual physical capability. She notes that the first significant sensory change from ordinary cave environment happens in the passage, not in the first chamber. It happens at a specific point, approximately 90 meters from the entrance, where the passage makes a slight bend to the left, and the quality of the air changes in a way she describes as difficult to characterize precisely, but immediately noticeable to anyone with significant cave experience. It is not a temperature change. It is not a smell change, or not primarily. It is something about the way the air feels in the passages, something about its texture or its density that is different from any other cave she has been in, and that she noticed on her first visit and has noticed consistently on every subsequent visit. She does not speculate about what causes this change. She simply notes that it is there, that it begins at approximately 90 meters from the entrance, and that it persists and intensifies the deeper into the system you travel. The first chamber is large, as described earlier. Asadurian has documented it fully, and its dimensions are in the published record. What is not in the published record, or is present only in the field journals, is the description of the crystal formations near the eastern wall that she found anomalous. She describes them in the field journal in more detail than she has published. She describes them as being, in their aggregate structure, like a response, not like a formation that occurred because certain physical conditions obtained in that space over time, which is the standard mechanism of all cave crystal growth, but like a formation that occurred in response to something, the way that a plant grows toward a light source or a magnetic needle swings toward north, directional in a way that implies an orienting force. She has not identified the orienting force. She has not found, in the published literature on cave mineralogy, any description of a formation mechanism that would produce this kind of directionality in a system where the relevant physical inputs, water chemistry, temperature, air movement, are not oriented in the same direction as the crystals. The crystals are pointing deeper into the system, into the south passage that continues from the chamber. Whatever they are responding to, or whatever they were responding to when they formed, is or was in the direction they are pointing. This is one of the observations she describes as beyond her current explanatory framework. She is not saying the crystals are supernatural or inexplicable in principle. She is saying that she does not currently have an explanation for them, and that the existing literature does not either. This is a statement about the current limits of speleological knowledge, not a claim about the fundamental nature of the phenomenon. The south passage from the first chamber continues, as the research record establishes, for a very long distance. Asadurian has covered approximately 11 kilometers of it, across 3 field seasons. The passage is not uniform. It widens into chambers and narrows into crawlways, and in several places requires technical rope work to descend vertical sections that the ancient water carved into the bedrock. The overall direction of the system is, as the geological modeling predicted, downward and south, following the slope of the underlying bedrock toward the deepest part of the plateau. The cairns that the 1,904 survey crew placed are present throughout the system. In the areas that Asadurian has explored, she has found them at the junctions where the passage branches, and at several points where the passage changes character significantly, as if the team was marking not just their route, but the significant features of their progress. The cairns are consistent with late 19th century survey practice, and are made of the local limestone, small stacks of flat rock placed by hand. They are not labelled in any way that Asadurian has been able to read, though she notes that in several cases, the top stone of a cairn has been scratched with a mark that she cannot interpret as a natural feature of the rock, but that she cannot interpret as a meaningful symbol either. The coat. She has returned to the coat in her field journals multiple times across the years since she first found it, and the returns reveal something about the quality of her attention to this object that is worth noting. She has measured the coat. It is a man's work coat, the kind that would have been standard issue for outdoor fieldwork in Canada in the early 20th century. It is made of a heavy wool blend. The manufacturer's label is present, but has faded to illegibility. The coat has several large patch pockets and was fastened by 6 buttons, of which 4 remain attached. The buttons are bone, which is consistent with coat manufacture of the early 20th century. She has photographed the coat from multiple angles and has tracked its condition across 3 field seasons. The condition is, she notes, remarkably good for an object that has been in a cave for more than 100 years. Cave environments can be very good for the long-term preservation of organic materials, depending on temperature, humidity, and the absence of biological agents of decay. The temperature in the chamber is stable and cold, the humidity is high but constant, and the absence of light and air movement has limited the biological activity that would otherwise degrade the fabric. Asadurian notes that the coat's survival is unusual, but not inexplicable in purely physical terms. What she finds harder to explain in purely physical terms is the quality of the fabric's preservation. The wool is not just intact, it is soft. It has a quality that she describes in her field journal as retained, as if the garment had been kept rather than simply not destroyed. She is careful to note that this is a subjective observation, that the specific quality of fabric preservation is not something that she has a precise instrumental measure for, and that she is describing a tactile impression that she acknowledges may say more about her own perceptual response to the situation than about the objective state of the fabric. But she makes the observation anyway, because the field journal is the place for honest observation, and her honest observation is that the coat feels like something that is being kept. The coat was found in the chamber that also contains the most intense version of the anomalous acoustic quality, the quality that she described as affecting her perception in a way she was not comfortable reporting without more data. In her field journal, she returns to the description of this acoustic quality multiple times, approaching it from different directions, trying to find a formulation that is accurate without claiming more than the observation supports. The formulation she eventually settles on, in a journal entry from her third field season, is this: the chamber does something to the distinction between what you are attending to and what is attending to you. In ordinary experience, you are the subject, and the world around you is the object. In this chamber, that distinction becomes unclear in a way that is not frightening in the moment, but that becomes very difficult to carry back to the surface in its original form. Each time I have been in this chamber, I have come out with the sense that I have been in the presence of something that was aware of my presence. I do not know what to do with this observation from a scientific standpoint. I include it here because it is what I observed, and the field journal is the place for what I observed. This is an extraordinary piece of scientific writing. Asadurian is one of the most rigorous cave geologists working in Canada. She has published in the best peer-reviewed journals in her field. She is not a person given to careless anthropomorphism or to the attribution of subjective properties to physical systems without careful qualification. When she writes that the chamber does something to the distinction between what you are attending to and what is attending to you, she has written that sentence carefully, and it means exactly what it says. Something in the chamber is aware of the presence of people who enter it. That is what the observation says, stripped of the careful scientific qualifications that Asadurian wraps around it. And the reason those qualifications are necessary is not that the observation is uncertain or ambiguous, but that the observation, if stated plainly, places a demand on the conceptual frameworks of the discipline that the discipline is not currently equipped to meet. A cave that is aware of who is in it. A cave that does something to the distinction between subject and object. A cave that changes permanently the people who go deep enough into it, in a way that the Kaska oral tradition has preserved for more generations than any written record in this hemisphere, and that 4 members of a Canadian government survey crew discovered in the summer of 1904, and that a senior federal official decided, on the basis of his briefing about what had happened, was not something the world was ready to know about. The cairns go all the way down. The coat is still on the boss. The passage continues past everything that has been mapped. What is at the end of it is the question. What the 4 who went deeper in 1904 found when they reached the end of it, or the place where their understanding of what they were looking at became sufficient that they stopped wanting to return to a place where they had less of it, is the question. And the honest answer is that we do not know, and that the not knowing is itself, as Costello said, an important piece of information about the nature of the thing being asked about. Let me tell you something about the broader context of the Liard Plateau, about what surrounds the cave in the larger landscape, because I think it adds something to the understanding of the specific place where this cave sits. The northwest corner of British Columbia, where the Liard River drains out of the Yukon into the broader watershed, is one of the least travelled and least documented regions of a country that has enormous amounts of less travelled and less documented terrain. It is not wilderness in the romantic sense that word sometimes carries. It is simply a very large amount of difficult and remote land where the conditions for human activity, as the industrial economy defines it, have never been good enough to draw the kind of sustained presence that would have resulted in thorough documentation. There are roads in the region, a few. There is the highway that runs up through the Yukon to Alaska. There are some resource extraction roads associated with mining operations that have come and gone over the decades. But the interior of the plateau, away from the river corridors, is in fact remote in the practical sense. You cannot reach it easily. You cannot be extracted from it quickly if something goes wrong, and the logistical cost of conducting sustained work in it is high enough that only well-funded operations with specific, compelling reasons to be there can justify it. This remoteness has preserved things. It has preserved the physical landscape from the modifications that development brings. It has preserved in the Kaska and Tahltan communities that have lived in relationship with this territory for many generations, a body of traditional knowledge about the land that has not been fully displaced by the knowledge systems that came with colonization. And it has preserved, in the specific fold of the plateau where the cave sits, whatever the cave holds, undisturbed except by the 7 people who entered it in 1904, and the 2 who entered it in 1906, and the geologist who has been working in it for 3 field seasons since 2003. Asadurian was not the first researcher to attempt physical access to the cave. There were at least 2 earlier attempts in the 1980s and 1990s by people who had read Fallow's early work and had sufficient resources and motivation to organize expeditions. Asadurian knows of these attempts from conversations with other researchers in the community, not from any documentary record, because neither attempt produced a documented record. The people who made them came back and did not publish anything, and this silence is itself significant. Researchers who conduct expeditions publish their results, or they explain why they cannot. The absence of any record from 2 earlier attempts to access the cave, by people who had enough interest in the question to organize expensive and logistically demanding expeditions, suggests that what they found was either nothing, in which case they would normally say so and explain why the expedition failed, or something that they decided not to publish. And the decision not to publish, for researchers who had gone to the considerable trouble of reaching the cave, is harder to explain than a decision to publish a null result. Asadurian has tried, discreetly, to make contact with the people she believes were responsible for these earlier expeditions. She has been unsuccessful in making direct contact. She has learned, from others who know them, that both are still living, and that both are, in the description she was given by a mutual colleague, not particularly interested in discussing their work in the plateau, not distressed, not damaged, not particularly interested in discussing it. The same quality that Gideon Peele had, 40 years as a bookkeeper in Hamilton, not particularly interested in going back. The cave is consistent, across a century and more of people approaching it. Those who get close enough to understand what they are in the presence of tend to do one of 2 things. Some go deeper, some come back and stay on the surface. But neither group tends to talk about what they encountered in any very direct way. The ones who went deeper can't, presumably. The ones who came back seem to arrive at an understanding that what they experienced is not something that benefits from being described, or is not something that description can adequately reach, or is not something that they have decided to try to share. This is the most unusual feature of the human record around this cave, and I want to make sure I have stated it clearly enough. People who get close to this cave, who experience something of what it does, tend not to describe it fully, not because they are afraid to, not because they are ordered not to, but because they arrive at a private understanding that the description will not serve. Vera Sobieski found that accuracy was the only thing she had left that felt like something she was actually holding, and she still could not bring herself to describe what she was being accurate about. William Crace wrote in his ledger for 30 years about not knowing whether he was brave or cowardly, and never described what the alternative would have entailed. Ren Asadurian has written several thousand words in field journals about a chamber whose acoustic quality she finds unaccountable, and the words circle the phenomenon without capturing it. There is something in the cave that language approaches but does not reach, and the people who have been closest to it seem to understand, after the encounter, that attempting to force it into language is not the right project. The right project is to sit with the knowledge that it is there, and to decide, for reasons that each person works out privately, what relationship to have with that knowledge. For Gideon Peele, the relationship was bookkeeping in Hamilton for 40 years. For Vera Sobieski, the relationship was 37 years of ordinary life, with an intermittent private return to the question in notebooks that no one was supposed to read. For William Crace, the relationship was 30 years of wondering whether he had been brave or cowardly without being able to settle the question, and eventually arriving at the expectation of finding out. For the four who went deeper, the relationship is whatever it is that the Casca oral tradition calls finished with the surface. All of these are, in their way, honest responses to what the cave presents. The cave does not seem to demand a particular response. It seems to make something available, and the people who encounter what it makes available decide, each in their own way, what to do with that encounter. The Casca community's decision, encoded in the oral tradition over many generations, was to not encounter it, to maintain the restriction, to protect the community from an offer that, however actually it might be meant, was incompatible with what the community needed to remain intact. That is also, in its way, an honest response. And the researchers, Fallow, Hebb, Costello, Asadorian, Harkness, the ones who have spent decades approaching the question from the outside, through documents and geology and oral tradition. Their response is the response of people who cannot go away from a question once they have seen its shape. They do not know what is in the cave. They know that something is there, that it has been there a very long time, and that it does something to people who encounter it that is real and consistent, and not like anything else in the record of human experience of the physical world. They are documenting the shape of the question as carefully as they can, for anyone who comes after them and wants to understand what is here and why it matters. That is the work. That is what they have been doing for 40 years. And when Constance Fallow died in 2019, that work was still ongoing, and the question was still open, and the cave was still there in the limestone, patient and consistent, doing what it has been doing for long enough, that the Casca oral tradition preserves the knowledge of it in a form that a 21st century linguist can still recognize and characterize. The limestone is 380 million years old. The cave follows the geometry of a reef that has not existed for 380 million years. Whatever is in the cave has been there for long enough to be named in languages older than any written record in this hemisphere. The cairns go all the way down. The coat is on the boss in the deep chamber, folded the way you fold something when you intend to come back for it. The passage continues. There is one more thread in the research that I have not yet followed all the way to its end, and it is the thread that connects the cave in northern British Columbia to a much larger question about the deep history of human presence in North America and what the people who lived in this part of the continent before any written record understood about the landscape they occupied. The conventional account of pre-colonial North America treats the indigenous peoples of the continent as having arrived here approximately 15,000 years ago, crossing from Siberia into Alaska during the last ice age and spreading southward through the continent over subsequent millennia. This is the founding narrative of North American archaeology, and it is supported by substantial genetic and archaeological evidence. But in the last 20 years, that foundational narrative has been increasingly complicated by evidence of human presence in the Americas that predates the generally accepted dates, sometimes significantly, and by evidence of connections between American populations and populations in other parts of the world that the Ice Age crossing model does not easily accommodate. The cave in the Liard Plateau exists within this broader revisionary moment in North American archaeological history. It is not directly connected to the debates about the peopling of the Americas, but the questions that Julian Harkness's research raised about who established the restriction on entering the cave and how long they had been in the region before the Casca arrived are questions that the revisionary archaeology directly addresses. Harkness's conclusion from the oral tradition was that the restriction predated Casca presence in the region by an unspecified but significant period. The best current archaeological estimates place Casca presence in the Liard corridor at somewhere between 800 and 1500 years, with significant uncertainty attached to both ends of that range. The archaeological record of human activity in the broader subarctic, however, extends back considerably further, 10,000 years in some areas, 12,000 years in others, with the specific timing and cultural affiliations of the various occupation phases still under active research. If the oral tradition is correct, that the restriction predates Casca presence by a significant period, and if we take a conservative interpretation of significant as meaning at least several generations, the establishment of the restriction could plausibly date to anywhere between 2,000 and 10,000 years ago, depending on assumptions about what the tradition is preserving and how stable oral transmission is over those timescales. This is speculative, Harkness was careful to say so, but it raises a question about what people were doing in the territory around the Liard Plateau and in what relationship to the cave for the thousands of years before the Casca arrived. The archaeological record of that occupation is sparse and fragmentary because the terrain is difficult and the conditions for artifact preservation in subarctic karst are not ideal, but it is not empty. A survey of the regional archaeology that Asadorian commissioned in preparation for her third field season identified several sites of human activity within 30 kilometers of the cave entrance, whose dates range from approximately 4,000 to 8,000 years before the present. These are not extensive sites. They are the kind of ephemeral traces that highly mobile hunter-gatherer populations leave in high-latitude terrain, small scatters of lithic material, occasional fire features, the traces of short-term occupation by small groups. But their presence establishes that people have been moving through this part of the plateau for at least 4,000 years, and probably for considerably longer. Whether any of these people entered the cave is not established by the archaeological record. The cave entrance is not immediately obvious from the surface, as Asadorian has noted. A person moving through the terrain without knowing what to look for might not identify it as a cave at all. But a person who had been in the territory for generations, who had learned to read the landscape with the depth of attention that sustained occupation produces, would eventually find it. The surface karst features are distinctive to anyone who knows how to read them. The entrance, once you know what to look for, is findable. And the oral tradition that the Casca inherited says that the people before them had found it, and that those people had established the restriction on the basis of their own experience with the cave. This is exactly what you would expect. If the cave had been doing what the research suggests, it does. For as long as the research suggests, it has been doing it. People find it. Some of them go in. Some of those who go in go deep enough. The community they belong to has to decide how to manage the relationship with a place that can permanently remove members. The decision to establish a restriction and encode it in oral tradition is a rational community response to a real and observed phenomenon. The tradition then travels forward in time with the community, passing through the various cultural transitions and population movements that characterize the deep history of the subarctic over thousands of years, and arriving, eventually, in the form that Margaret Drury recorded in 1938, and that Julian Harkness was able to access and characterize in the first decade of the 21st century. The specific language changes. The specific framing may evolve, but the core of the knowledge, that this place is the place where the stone speaks, that it changes people permanently, that the change is experienced as clarification rather than loss, that the appropriate community response is to not enter it, is preserved. This is an extraordinary piece of knowledge transmission. Oral traditions can preserve specific facts across very long periods under the right conditions, when the knowledge is important enough to the community to be maintained with care, when the transmission is embedded in social structures that ensure its regular rehearsal, and when the community's continued occupation of the territory provides ongoing confirmation of the knowledge's relevance. The Casca oral tradition's preservation of specific knowledge about a specific limestone cave on the Liard Plateau may be one of the longest continuous transmissions of knowledge about a specific physical feature in North American history. That is worth saying plainly. Whatever is in that cave, it has been important enough to the peoples of this territory to preserve specific knowledge about it across somewhere between 1,000 and 8,000 years of continuous oral transmission. That is not a trivial fact. It is a statement about the significance of what the cave does to the people who encounter it, and about the importance that significance has had for the communities that live in its presence. And then, in the summer of 1904, a government survey team found the cave without knowing any of this history, without knowing the restriction, without knowing the tradition, without any of the context that the Casca community had been maintaining for generations. They found it as explorers of the early 20th century found things. with the confident instrumentalism of a civilization that believed the world's mysteries were available to be discovered and documented and brought within the compass of official knowledge. 4 of them went deeper. 3 came back changed. And the Canadian government decided that this was not something that should be part of the official record of a country that was, in 1904, still very much in the project of establishing what its official record would say about the nature of the land it had claimed. The cave did not care about any of that. The cave has been there for 380 million years. The restriction has been in place for somewhere between 1 and 8,000 years. The 7 men who found it in 1904 were, in the long perspective of the cave's history, a recent and brief event. The 3 who came back are long dead. The 4 who went deeper are in whatever state the cave produces in people who go deep enough. The research community that has been working to understand what happened is composed of living people who are still working, still writing, still approaching the question from different directions. And the cave is there, in the fold of the plateau, with the entrance that looks like a shadow at the base of a rock face, and the passage that slopes down and levels out into the first chamber, and the crystal formations that point south, and the cairns that mark the route all the way down to the coat on the limestone boss and past it into the deep system, and the acoustic chamber that does something to the distinction between what you are attending to and what is attending to you. It is all still there. It has all been there for a very long time. Whatever the cave is making available to the people who go deep enough has been available for as long as anyone in this territory has known the cave was there. The researchers have mapped the outline of the question. The question is real. The evidence is solid. The convergence across different knowledge systems, the Casca oral tradition, the archival record, the geological fieldwork, the private notebooks of the survivors, is not the convergence of artifacts of imagination, but of independent observations of a real physical and experiential phenomenon. What the phenomenon is, what it means, whether it is something that our current understanding of the physical world has frameworks for, or whether understanding it fully would require frameworks we have not yet developed. These remain open questions. They are among the most interesting open questions I know of in the entire field of Canadian history and the history of human presence in North America. They are questions that a small community of careful researchers has been working on for 40 years, and that the Casca oral tradition has been working on in its own way for much longer. The field journals of Ren Asadorian are in 2 university archives, accessible to researchers with appropriate credentials. The papers of Constance Fallow are in the library of a Canadian university, a substantial collection. The ledger of William Crace, acquired by Costello in 2006, has been transcribed and is held at the institution where Costello works. The Sobieski notebook is with the family, copies shared with the research community. The Drury Field Journals are in the National Archives. The 1906 Deputy Minister's letter is in the wrong file where Costello found it, where it still sits, still accessible to anyone who knows to look for it in that particular drawer. The Garfield Memorandum is in the personal papers donated to the university library by the geologist whose collection it was part of. All of this is findable, all of it is real. The research community that has assembled this picture has done the work with appropriate rigor and appropriate humility. They are not claiming more than the evidence supports. They are claiming, carefully, that the evidence supports the conclusion that something real and significant, and not yet fully understood, is happening in a limestone cave in the northwest corner of British Columbia, and that people have known this for a very long time, and that the knowledge has been consistently treated by the people and institutions who encountered it as knowledge that required careful handling. That is the honest account of where things stand. The cave is there. The research continues. The question is open. And somewhere in the deep system, past everything that has been mapped, the passage continues into whatever the 4 who went deeper in 1904 found at the end of it. The limestone holds its record. The cave holds whatever it holds. The question waits, patient as stone. I want to close this part of the story by returning to Constance Fallow, because she is the person who found the beginning of all of it, and because the way she described the work at the end of her life tells you something important about what it means to spend 40 years approaching a question you cannot fully answer. She said, in her last interview before she died, with a Canadian academic who was writing about the history of Canadian historical scholarship, that the 1904 expedition had been the best and worst project of her career. The best because it had led her to the most interesting evidence she had ever worked with, evidence that had actually surprised her and actually changed how she thought about the relationship between official records and the events they are supposed to record. The worst because it had made every other project she had ever done feel, in some way she could not quite articulate, too small. Not intellectually smaller, not less important in terms of its contribution to historical knowledge, just smaller in scale in a way that the 1904 expedition project had shifted her sense of what scale meant. She said that she had come to believe, over 40 years of working on this question, that the most important things that happen in history are often the things that the official record works hardest to contain. Not because the official record is dishonest, exactly, but because official records are designed to accommodate what societies already have frameworks for, and the most significant events are often the ones that challenge or exceed those frameworks. The 1904 expedition found something in the Liard Plateau that the Canada of 1904 did not have a framework for, and the response of the official record was to not record it. And what that meant, for the historical understanding of that event and everything around it, was that it had to be reconstructed from fragments by people who were willing to look for what was not in the record and to ask why it was not there. She said she was glad someone had done that work, and that she was glad she had been one of the people who did it, even though she had not answered the underlying question and was not going to answer it in the time she had left. The question was still there. It was a better question than when she had found it, because more was known about its shape and more evidence had been assembled to understand what it was touching. But it was still open, and it was going to stay open, and that was, she thought, appropriate. Because the thing that the question was about was not something that should be closed easily. She died in 2019. She was 75 years old. Her papers are in the university library. The work continues. The cave is still there. I want to take some time now to think about the specific quality of the mystery that the 1904 Liard Cave expedition represents, because I think it is different, in kind, from most of the mysteries that attach themselves to historical events in the Canadian North, and understanding the difference helps clarify what makes this one worth the kind of sustained attention that Fallow and Costello and Asadurian and Harkness have given it. Most mysteries in the history of northern exploration are mysteries of circumstance. People died or disappeared or failed at their objectives for reasons that are not fully documented, and the task of the researcher is to reconstruct those reasons from the available evidence. The Franklin expedition, which is probably the most famous unsolved mystery in Canadian northern history, is a mystery of this kind. We know approximately what happened. The ships were trapped in ice. The men died over an extended period from a combination of scurvy, lead poisoning, exposure, and starvation, and they attempted an overland retreat that ultimately failed. The mystery is in the details, in the exact sequence of events, in the decisions that were made and why, in the final days of the last survivors. It is a human mystery, a tragedy of circumstances and decisions, and the research into it is the research of filling in the details of a framework that is already substantially understood. The 1904 Liard Cave expedition is not that kind of mystery. The framework is the mystery. What we do not understand is not the sequence of events or the decisions made, but the nature of the thing that those decisions were made in response to. 4 people went into a cave and did not come back, not because they were trapped or injured or caught by a storm, but because, on the evidence, they encountered something that made not coming back the natural continuation of what they were doing. This is a category of event that the history of northern exploration, with its rich record of tragedy and survival and hard circumstances, does not have a standard framework for. The closest analogies in the historical record are probably the stories that come from spiritual and contemplative traditions rather than from exploration history. Stories of people who entered a state of retreat or withdrawal and found, in that state, something that made the return to ordinary life feel incomplete or unnecessary. The medieval accounts of hermits and mystics who went into the wilderness and did not come back. The accounts, in various indigenous traditions, of people who went on vision quests and returned transformed, or did not return, in a transformation that the community understood as a transition to a different kind of existence rather than a death. These are accounts that our secular, scientific, official frameworks do not have good ways of handling, but that the human record has preserved because the phenomenon they describe, whatever it is, has been real enough and consistent enough across time and culture to be worth preserving. The Casca oral tradition about the cave is one of these accounts. The specific thing that distinguishes it from the stories of Franklin's men or any other northern tragedy is that the tradition understands what happened to the people who went in as a transition, not a disaster, as something the community chose not to enter into as a matter of community decision, not as something that victimized the people who encountered it. This is a very specific framing, and the researchers in this story have been cautious about adopting it because it requires assumptions about the nature of what happened in the cave that go beyond what they can verify with the documentary evidence they have access to. But the framing fits. It fits the William Crace ledger, with its 30 years of wondering whether he was brave or cowardly, rather than 30 years of processing trauma. It fits the Vera Sobieski notebook, with its description of the four as people who understood something more fully than the people who came back, rather than as people who were lost. It fits the way Gideon Peele spent his subsequent life, not haunted, not broken, but anchored, as if the anchoring were a deliberate project, rather than an incidental consequence of what he had experienced. And it fits, in a way that is harder to articulate, but is no less real, the quality of Ren Asadorian's field journal descriptions of the deep chamber. She is not describing a terrifying place. She is describing a place where something is happening that her frameworks do not accommodate, and she is doing so with the careful, slightly awed precision of someone who has encountered something she understands is significant, without being able to say exactly what its significance is. Significance without explanation, mystery without disaster, a permanent change that is not experienced as loss. These are the qualities that cluster around the Liard Cave, across all of the sources that touch it, and they are the qualities that make it different in kind from the other mysteries in the history of Canadian northern exploration. Let me address something that I have been circling for a while, because I think the audience for a story like this deserves a direct engagement with it. There is a tradition of attributing unexplained phenomena in remote locations to supernatural causes. Ghosts, spirits, entities, forces outside the natural world as our current understanding defines it. It is a very old tradition, and it is present in virtually every human culture, and the experience of encountering something in a landscape that your frameworks cannot accommodate has, across history, often been interpreted through the lens of that tradition. People see things, feel things, experience things that they cannot explain, and the interpretive tradition that is available to them shapes how they describe and understand what they have experienced. The researchers in this story are working within the scientific tradition, which provides a different set of interpretive frameworks. They are not trying to invoke supernatural explanations. They are trying to find natural explanations, physical and psychological and cultural and historical explanations, for a set of observations that resists those explanations at the current level of our knowledge. And what they are arriving at, across 40 years of careful work, is not a supernatural explanation, but something more interesting, a recognition that the natural world, specifically the physical and experiential properties of this particular cave in this particular limestone, is doing something that our current scientific frameworks cannot fully characterize. This is not a failure of the scientific approach. It is the scientific approach working correctly. The scientific approach, done properly, includes acknowledging the limits of current knowledge. It includes naming what is observed, even when what is observed does not fit existing categories. It includes maintaining the question open until the evidence justifies a conclusion, rather than forcing a premature conclusion on inadequate evidence. What Asadorian observed in the acoustic chamber is real. It is observed by a trained scientist with decades of experience in the relevant domain, under conditions that preclude the most obvious mundane explanations. She cannot explain it. She has noted that it is beyond her current explanatory framework. This is not a supernatural claim. It is a statement about the current state of knowledge and the current limits of available frameworks, and the question of what explanation will eventually prove adequate, whether it is a physical explanation involving properties of the cave's geology that current speleological science does not fully understand, whether it is a psychological explanation involving the interaction between certain environmental conditions and human perception and cognition, whether it is something involving the nature of consciousness and its relationship to specific kinds of physical environments, whether it is something that requires frameworks that do not yet exist. this remains still open. Open questions are not failures. They are the places where knowledge advances. The history of science is the history of open questions, eventually receiving answers that nobody anticipated and that required framework changes to accommodate. The specific nature of what is in the Liard Cave may eventually be explicable within frameworks that do not yet exist or that we have not yet applied to this domain. Or it may remain, as Costello suggests, a question whose not knowing is itself an important piece of information about the nature of the thing being asked about. Both of these are possible. Neither of them requires supernatural explanation. Both of them require taking the evidence seriously, on its own terms, without forcing it into available categories that do not fit. This is the kind of intellectual honesty that the researchers in this story have maintained across 40 years. It is the kind of intellectual honesty that I try to bring to the stories I tell in these videos. The world is actually strange in ways that our current frameworks do not fully accommodate. That strangeness is not diminished by taking it seriously, and it is not illuminated by forcing it into categories that do not fit. The cave in the Liard Plateau is actually strange. The evidence for its strangeness is solid and carefully assembled. The question of what is responsible for the strangeness is open. That is enough. That is exactly enough. That is, if you are willing to sit with it, one of the most interesting enough for now positions that the history of the Canadian North has to offer. Let me tell you about the summer of 1904 one more time, from the beginning, in a different way. 7 people depart from a rail camp on the Liard River in the summer heat of early July. The camp is a collection of tents and rough buildings on the riverbank, smelling of canvas and wood smoke, and the sulphurous mud of the river margin at low water. The 7 people are professionals engaged in the ordinary work of a government survey operation, measuring, recording, documenting the terrain through which they pass, building the official record of a country that is still, in its second decade as a confederation, learning what it actually contains. They move northward from the river and into the plateau. The terrain is difficult in the way that subarctic karst terrain is difficult. Not dramatically treacherous, but persistently demanding, asking for attention at every step, offering no comfortable paths, providing the low shrub cover and scattered rock that characterizes this landscape through the short summer season. The horses carry the heavy equipment. The people carry their tools and their notebooks and their professional competence and their assumptions about what they are going to find, which are the assumptions of their time and their discipline. Orderly geology, mappable terrain, a landscape that will yield its structure to systematic documentation. They spend 2 weeks on the plateau before they find the entrance. Or perhaps the entrance finds them, in the sense that it is simply there, in the fold of the land, and they are walking through the fold, and the shadow at the base of the rock face is in their path. And the person at the front of the group stops and looks at it and says something to the others, and the group gathers around the entrance and looks in. What did they see from the entrance? They saw the beginning of a passage. They saw limestone descending at a moderate angle. They had torches and possibly lanterns, and the professional instinct of people who documented things for a living. And they went in, because going in is what you do when you are a survey team and you find an undocumented geological feature. You document it, you measure it, you describe it, you mark the entrance on your survey grid, and you establish its orientation and you follow it as far as your equipment and time allow. They followed it a very long way. Since they placed their cairns as they went, which tells you that they were following standard survey procedure, that they intended to be able to find their way back, that they were, at the point where they placed each cairn, functioning as professional surveyors, conducting a systematic documentation of an unusual geological feature. They were not panicking, they were not lost, they were doing their jobs. At some point in the deeper system, 4 of them were no longer doing their jobs in any sense that the surface world would recognize. The transition from professional documentation to whatever they were doing in the deep chamber, to whatever it was that made 4 of them decide not to come back, is the transition that no document in any archive describes. It happened in a cave in northern British Columbia in the summer of 1904, in the Devonian limestone of the Liard Plateau, in the negative space of a 380 million year old reef, in the presence of whatever it is that the Casca oral tradition calls the place where the stone speaks. And then 3 of them came back, and the summer ended, and they travelled south, and they sat by a stove in Whitehorse for 2 days and did not talk about what they had found. And then they went back to their lives and did not talk about it publicly for the rest of those lives. And the government official, who eventually heard a private account of what had happened, decided that the world was not ready and wrote a letter, and someone added a pencil note that said, "Do not go back." And the letter ended up in the wrong file, where it sat for 60 years, until a document historian, with a long, patient curiosity about the wrong things in the wrong files, pulled it out into the light. This is the shape of the story. This is what happened. This is what the evidence says, carefully assembled and honestly characterized. The rest is the question that remains open, that the cave holds in its limestone, in its ancient reef geometry, in its passages and chambers, and the coat on the boss in the deep system, and the cairns going all the way down. Rest now. Let the limestone hold its record. And, posse. The cave will be there when any of us needs to ask the question again. And somewhere in the deep system, past the coat, past the cairns, past everything that has been reached and documented and carefully written down in the field journals and the archival folders and the private notebooks of the people who came close to it and came back, the passage continues into whatever the four found at the end of it. The stone speaks. It has been speaking for a very long time. And somewhere below the plateau, in the dark, in the ancient reef geometry of 380 million years of limestone, 4 people who went in one summer morning in 1904 and did not come back out, or whatever they became in there, in the presence of whatever it is that makes the deeper you go, the more you understand what you are looking at. The question is open, the cave is patient, the limestone is 380 million years old. And you, right now, wherever you are in the world, in whatever room or outdoor space or transit seat this story has reached you, you are in the presence of a mystery that has been patient for longer than any of us can truly imagine. Not a supernatural mystery and not an ordinary one. Something in between those categories. Something at the edge of what our frameworks can hold. Something that careful researchers have spent decades approaching with the best tools they have and have not yet reached the center of. That is enough for tonight. That is, honestly, more than enough. Let the question settle. Let the limestone hold it. The cave has been holding its secret for a very long time, and it will hold it a while longer, while you rest, while the researchers plan their next expeditions, while the field journals sit in their university archives, waiting for the next careful reader. The passage continues. The cairns go all the way down. Sleep well wherever you are. There is a question that people who hear this story sometimes ask, and that I want to address directly, because I think it touches something important about what this kind of mystery means and why it persists. The question is, why does it matter? Why does it matter that a government survey team found a cave in northern British Columbia in 1904, and that 4 members of the team did not come back, and that the Canadian government made the decision to not document this in the official record? Why does it matter enough that 4 researchers have spent decades of their professional lives working on it, that an oral tradition maintained it across many generations, that a senior federal official thought it important enough to falsify a government document? I think the answer has several layers, and I want to work through all of them, because each one reveals something different about what the Liard Cave story is actually about. The first layer is the simplest. It matters because it happened. 4 people went into a cave in the summer of 1904 and did not come back. They were real people. They had names, which Fallow eventually found in the Dunmire letter. They had lives before the cave, and they had, apparently, whatever they have after it. But we have no record of the after, and no witness to the during, and no documentation of what their experience was. The absence of that record is itself a fact about what happened, and the fact that the absence was deliberately created is itself a fact about the significance of what happened. The historical record has an obligation to the people it concerns, and when that record has been deliberately deformed to erase 4 people from it, the work of restoring them to the record is inherently worthwhile, independent of the mystery of what happened to them. The second layer is about the nature of the suppression itself. When a government decides to alter its own records to hide an event, that decision reveals something about the event and something about the government. In this case, the decision was made by a senior federal official who had enough information about what had happened to believe that public knowledge of it would be destabilizing, not embarrassing, not politically inconvenient, but destabilizing in a way that made the risk of falsifying a government document preferable to the risk of full disclosure. Understanding what kind of event generates that kind of institutional response is an important part of understanding both the event and the institutions that shape the official account of history. The third layer is the most interesting and the most difficult to articulate, and it is the layer that I think explains why this story has generated the kind of sustained attention from researchers who are in fact careful and rigorous people rather than sensation seekers. The third layer is about what the cave represents as a feature of the physical world. If what the evidence suggests is true, if there is something in the Liard limestone that produces a permanent, non-damaging reorientation of perception and understanding in people who encounter it deeply enough, then what that means is that the physical world contains something that our current understanding of the physical world cannot fully account for. This is not a claim that requires supernatural explanation. It is a claim that our current scientific frameworks have limits, and that the Liard cave exists at or beyond one of those limits. This is actually not an unusual claim in the history of science. The history of science is the history of encountering the limits of current frameworks, and of building new frameworks to accommodate what the current ones cannot. What is unusual about the Liard cave is that the encounter with the limit is not an encounter in a laboratory or in an astronomical observation, but an encounter in a landscape, in a physical place that people can go to and experience directly. The cave is not a mathematical anomaly or a theoretical paradox. It is a place, and whatever it does it consistently to multiple people across a long period of time, and it produces results that are documented in sources that span different knowledge systems and different centuries. This consistency is significant. Hallucinations are inconsistent. Psychological suggestion produces variable results, depending on suggestibility and context. But the accounts of what happens to people who go deep enough into the Liard cave, across the Casca oral tradition, and the archival record, and the private notebooks, and the field journals, describe the same thing: a permanent change in the direction of greater clarity about something, experienced not as loss, but as clarification, incompatible with continued ordinary surface life, but not traumatic in the way that damage is traumatic. This consistency across sources that could not have influenced each other and that approach the phenomenon from very different directions is the strongest argument for the reality of the phenomenon. It is the same kind of argument that scientific evidence typically makes. Different independent observations pointing at the same thing. The Liard cave passes this test better than most mysteries of this kind, because the sources that describe it are independent in origin, and the descriptions are consistent across sources. So what the cave matters for, at this level, is the question of what the physical world contains. A consistent, independently documented, geologically situated phenomenon that our current frameworks cannot fully account for is a significant piece of information about the nature of the world we live in. It suggests that there are features of physical reality that we have not yet incorporated into our understanding, and that at least one of those features is present in a specific limestone cave in northwestern British Columbia, and has been present there for long enough that the peoples of that territory found it necessary to develop and maintain specific cultural knowledge about it. That is a significant claim. It is also a claim that the evidence, carefully assembled and honestly characterized, actually supports. There is a particular quality to the attention that this story rewards. It rewards the kind of attention that does not demand resolution, that can sit with a still open question without forcing it to close prematurely. It rewards patience. It rewards a willingness to let the evidence tell you what it tells you rather than what you would prefer it to tell you. And it rewards, I think, a kind of intellectual humility about the nature of the world and the limits of our current understanding of it. The researchers who have worked on this question have all, in different ways, modelled this kind of attention. Constance Fallow, who spent 40 years approaching a question she did not fully answer and found that work worthwhile. Raymond Costello, who has spent 20 years on a documentary problem that the documentary record cannot fully resolve, and who finds, in the not knowing, an important piece of information rather than a failure. Rena Sadorian, who has been to the deep chamber and found things she cannot explain, and who is planning to go back rather than concluding that she has reached the limits of what the cave can tell her. Julian Harkness, who has worked with oral tradition knowledge that required him to hold the line between characterizing and appropriating, to represent what the tradition says, without claiming more than it says, or using it in ways that serve his purposes, rather than the community's. These are models of careful intellectual engagement with a actually difficult question. They are worth attending to not just for what they have found, but for how they have gone about finding it. And the cave itself is worth attending to, with whatever quality of attention you can bring to a place you have not visited and may not be able to visit. The physical description is available in the published papers and the field journals and the geological modelling that Asadorian has done. The historical record is available in the archives where Fallow and Costello found the documents they found. The oral tradition is characterized, as much as it can be, without appropriating it, in Harkness's published work. The private notebooks of the survivors are, in the relevant passages, available in the published papers that have quoted from them. All of this is accessible to anyone who wants to go looking for it. The research community has made it accessible, carefully and responsibly, for exactly this reason. Because the question is a real question, because the evidence is solid, and because the story of what happened in that cave in the summer of 1904 is a story that belongs to the historical record of the country where it happened and to the intellectual record of the human species' ongoing attempt to understand the world it lives in. The cave is in the limestone is on the plateau is in northwestern British Columbia. The passage goes from the entrance down through the first chamber and along the south passage for the 11 kilometers that have been documented, and then continues into the deeper system that has not been fully mapped. The cairns go all the way down, the coat is on the boss. The acoustic chamber is at whatever depth the third field season reached. The question of what is past, the deepest documented point, remains open. And somewhere in the deep system, the four who went deeper in 1904 are whatever they became in the presence of whatever is there. Not dead, if the evidence and the oral tradition are pointing in the direction they appear to be pointing. Not lost, in any sense, that implies tragedy. Something else, something that the Kaska oral tradition found worthy of preservation across many generations, something that Vera Sobieski approached in her notebook with a precision that she said was the only thing she had left that felt like something she was actually holding, something that the limestone has been holding in the passages carved through the ancient reef, in the dark, and the consistency and the long patience of stone. I want to end with the light, because that is where the story begins, really, with the light outside the cave entrance in the summer of 1904, with 7 people standing in the short subarctic summer under a sky that is never fully dark at that latitude in July, looking at a shadow at the base of a rock face and deciding to go in. The light in the subarctic in late July is something that people who have not experienced it find difficult to fully imagine from description. The sun barely sets. The sky in the north remains luminous through the brief night hours. The landscape is lit by a long, flat golden light that comes from very low on the horizon for most of the day. A light that makes the colors of the terrain more intense and the shadows longer and the sense of space and distance more acute than the overhead light of southern latitudes. It is an extraordinary light to be in, and the people who spend time in it often describe a quality of heightened perception that it produces. A feeling of being more awake to the physical world than they usually are, of being more present in the landscape they are moving through. The 7 people of the 1904 expedition were moving through that light. They had been in it for 2 weeks, since leaving the rail camp at the river. They had been reading the landscape with the sustained attention of people doing geological and topographic work in remote terrain. They had been, in the most literal sense, paying attention to the physical world around them with more focus and more acuity than most people ever bring to their ordinary lives. And then they found the shadow at the base of the rock face, and the shadow was the entrance to a cave, and the cave went down, and they went in. The light at the entrance fades over 30 meters. Past that transition, there is no natural light. The cave is dark in the complete and absolute way that only places that have been without light for a very long time are dark. Not the darkness of a room with the curtains drawn, which still carries the residue of light in its walls and objects. Not the darkness of a cloudy night, which still has the ambient glow of the sky and the reflected light of the earth. The darkness of the deep cave is the darkness of a place where light has never been, where the concept of light applies only to what you bring with you, and the moment you extinguish your torch or your lantern, the darkness that replaces it is total and immediate and ancient. They brought light with them. Of course they did. They were professionals, and they followed that light into the limestone, marking their route with cairns, documenting what they found, doing their jobs, until 4 of them encountered whatever it was that made doing their jobs feel like the wrong project. And then there were 3 lights going back toward the entrance, and the summer outside still burning with that flat gold light that comes from very low on the horizon, and the rock face with its shadow at the base, and 3 people walking back into the light of the world they had started from. The cave was behind them. Whatever they had been close to was in the dark. The light was ahead, and they chose the light. Whether that was brave or cowardly is the question William Crace spent 30 years not being able to answer. Whether it was right or wrong is a question that does not have an answer that the evidence can support. It was a choice made by 3 people in a cave in the summer of 1904, in the presence of something that their frameworks could not accommodate, and that they decided, for reasons they kept private for the rest of their lives, not to pursue. The light outside the cave was real. The world it led back to was real. The rest of their lives, ordinary as they were in the ways that ordinary lives are ordinary, were real. And the cave, when they left it, was still there, still dark, still doing whatever it has been doing since before any person walked into it. The story ends there, in the light outside the cave entrance in the subarctic summer, with 3 people walking back to the world and 4 people not following. It ends there, and it keeps going, in the research and the archives and the field journals and the oral tradition and the carved limestone passages of the deep system, all of it still present, still active, still pointing at a question that the evidence opens and does not close. This is the story of the 1904 Liard Cave expedition. This is what the evidence says, as carefully as I can say it. The rest is the caves. If you have found this story worth your time tonight, I would be glad to know. Leave a comment with where you are in the world right now and what time it is there. Someone in the north of Canada, maybe, who knows that plateau and its light. Someone in a city somewhere, lying in the dark with this story in their ears, thinking about limestone and ancient reefs and 4 people who went deeper in the summer of 1904 and did not come back. Someone who has their own experience of a question that the evidence opens but does not close. Subscribe if you would like more of these long, careful approaches to the stories that official history did not quite contain. There will be more. The questions are inexhaustible. The records are imperfect and partial, and full of one-sentence summaries where full accounts should be, and the work of finding what is not in them and asking why it is not there goes on as long as there are researchers willing to do it. The cave is in the limestone. The cairns go all the way down. The light is at the entrance, as it always has been, as it was in July 1904 when 7 people stood at the shadow at the base of the rock face and went in. Sleep well. The question will be here in the morning. Let me tell you about the winter that follows the summer of the expedition, because the winters in this part of the world are not incidental. They are part of the landscape's character in a way that shapes everything that happens in and around the plateau. And the winter of 1904 to 1905 is the winter in which the 3 survivors returned to their lives and began the process of managing what they had experienced. The subarctic winter descends on the Liard Plateau region in September, which is early by most standards. And by November, the landscape has become something actually alien to anyone raised in the temperate parts of the continent. The temperature falls below freezing and stays there for months. The days shorten until, at the winter solstice, there are barely 4 hours of usable light. The landscape hardens. The rivers freeze from the shore outward until only the fastest currents resist, and then those too slow and lock into the same silence that covers everything else. The snow, when it comes, is not the wet, heavy snow of the southern latitudes, but the dry, cold, fine snow of extreme cold, which sifts into every gap and crack and produces, across the plateau, a surface of unbroken white that absorbs sound and reflects the pale winter light in a way that makes the landscape seem simultaneously very bright and completely still. Under all of that, the cave does not change. The cave's interior temperature is constant year-round, the temperature of the rock, which reflects the average annual surface temperature of the region and varies not at all with the seasons. The passages and chambers maintain their consistency through the winter and the summer, through the freeze and the thaw, through the long bright days of July and the short dark days of December. Whatever is in the deep system has been undisturbed by the passage of seasons for as long as the cave has existed. When Ren Asadurian describes the cave as patient, she is describing something literally true about the way geological timescales and cave environments interact. A cave does not experience the seasonality that shapes the experience of every organism that lives on the surface. Its internal conditions are stable in a way that nothing on the surface, not even the most sheltered location, fully achieves. The cold in winter does not penetrate. The heat of summer does not penetrate. The darkness is complete and absolute regardless of what the sky above is doing. The cave is a constant in a landscape of variation, and whatever is in it is undisturbed by the rhythms that organize life on the surface of the plateau. The 3 survivors of the 1904 expedition returned to that seasonal world. They went back to Whitehorse in October, just as the first serious cold was arriving. They went south as quickly as transportation allowed, before the freeze-up that would lock the rivers and make movement across the territory significantly more difficult. By November, they were in the world of ordinary life, the world of seasons and light and social obligation and the practical demands of earning a living, and the cave in the limestone of the Liard Plateau was locked under its winter of silence and snow, unchanged, continuing to be whatever it was. And in that ordinary world, the 3 survivors were doing the thing that Gideon Peele described in his letter to Dunmire, sitting by the stove and not talking about what they had found. Not talking is a complex activity. It requires more sustained attention than most people attribute to it. The deliberate maintenance of silence about a specific experience, the ongoing choice not to describe something that you carry with you, is a practice that shapes the relationship between the person and the experience in ways that accumulate over time. Vera Sobieski, who did eventually write about it, was writing against this silence, working obliquely towards something she could not approach directly. William Crace, who wrote for 30 years in his ledger, was writing within it, approaching the question repeatedly and circling back to the same uncertainty. Gideon Peele did not write at all, or not in any way that has survived, and his silence was the most complete of the 3. What does it mean to carry something in silence for decades? It means, I think, that the thing you are carrying becomes part of the texture of your ordinary life without ever becoming part of its explicit content. It shapes things without naming them. It is present in the particular quality of attention you bring to your daily work, in the things you find interesting and the things you find flat, in the way you respond to questions about the North and to questions about what you did in 1904, and to questions about what it felt like to be close to something that you decided not to follow into the dark. For all 3 of them, that particular quality of attention, that thing carried in silence, was present for the rest of their lives. The evidence of the notebooks and the ledger shows it there, surfacing obliquely in private writing, shaping the way they thought about the questions that mattered to them. They were not broken by it. They were not haunted in any dramatic sense. They were people who had encountered something at the edge of what the human frameworks for understanding to experience can hold, and who had spent their subsequent lives in the company of that encounter, managing it with whatever tools their temperaments and their times provided. This is, I think, the most honest and the most human part of this story, not the mystery of what is in the cave, but the lived reality of the 3 people who got close to it and came back. The long ordinary years after the extraordinary summer, the bookkeeping and the notebook entries and the ledger pages, and the sit by the stove and not talk, and the work as a janitor in Medicine Hat, and the move to Manitoba and the ordinary life in Whitehorse that eventually became a life. Somewhere else, far from the plateau, they lived their lives. They carried what they had found. They managed it as best they could with the resources available to them, and they left, in the fragments that the researchers eventually found, the shape of what they had carried, the outline of something that each of them had decided, for their own reasons, not to pursue beyond the point they had reached. William Crace wondered, for 30 years, whether that decision was brave or cowardly. He expected to find out eventually. He died in 1939, and whatever he found out, if he found anything out, is not in the ledger. But the wondering itself is worth attending to. The question of whether choosing to remain on the surface is brave or cowardly is a question that the conventional frameworks of courage and its absence do not fully address. Courage usually means going toward the thing you fear. Cowardice usually means fleeing from it. But the four who went deeper in 1904 were not going toward something they feared. They were going toward something they understood, increasingly, as the deeper they went. And the three who came back were not fleeing from something they feared. They were stepping back from a threshold they had seen clearly and deciding with full awareness not to cross it. The framework of courage and cowardice, with its implicit valorization of going toward rather than stepping back, does not easily accommodate a decision made in full awareness of what lies on the other side of a threshold. It is a framework that assumes the right choice is usually to move forward, to pursue, to press on. But the Casca oral tradition, which has the longest perspective on the cave and its threshold, is not organized around the framework of courage and cowardice. It is organized around the framework of community and the question of what kind of relationship is compatible with the life the community needs to live. Within that framework, stepping back from the threshold is not cowardice but care. Care for the community, care for the life that you have built, in the relationships and obligations and ordinary work of the surface world. William Crace did not have this framework available to him. He had a late 19th century working man's understanding of courage and its alternatives, and he spent 30 years applying it, imperfectly and inconclusively, to a decision that the framework was not built to evaluate. He could not settle the question. He died without settling it. And the ledger he left behind is, in its 30 years of inconclusive wondering, one of the most honest documents in the entire research record, because it shows a person honestly trying to understand something that his available frameworks could not accommodate, and honestly failing to force it into those frameworks, and actually living with that failure for the rest of his life. That is the human center of this story. Not the cave, not the government suppression, not the geological anomalies, or the acoustic chamber, or the coat on the limestone boss. The human center is three people who got close to something at the edge of what the human experience of the physical world typically encompasses, and who spent the rest of their lives carrying that encounter in the ordinary texture of ordinary days. The cave is extraordinary. What it contains, or what it does, or what it makes available to people who go deep enough is extraordinary. But the lives of the three survivors were ordinary, and it was in that ordinariness, in the janitor work and the bookkeeping and the notebook entries and the private wondering, that the encounter with the extraordinary was actually lived. That is where the story actually happened, for them. Not in the dark passage of the cave, but in all the subsequent light of their ordinary years. The darkness and the light, the passage and the surface, the extraordinary encounter and the ordinary life that comes after it, that carries the encounter without being able to fully describe it, or fully accommodate it, or fully let it go. This is the story of the 1904 Liard Cave Expedition. All of it, from the one-sentence summary in the Ottawa Archive, to the coat on the limestone boss, to the 30 years of William Crace's private wondering, is part of the same story, and it is a story that rewards the kind of patient attention that the researchers have given it, and that I hope this account has given it, in some small measure. The cave is there, the question is open, the limestone is patient. And wherever you are tonight, in whatever room this story has reached you, you are in the presence of a mystery that has been patient since long before any person stood at its entrance. The question of what is at the end of the passage is not a question that will be answered tonight. It may not be answered in our lifetimes. But it is a real question, about the real world, supported by real evidence, and the asking of it is its own kind of engagement with the world's depth. Rest now. The cave will be there in the morning. The cairns will still go all the way down. The coat will still be on the boss. The passage will still continue. And the stone will still be speaking to whoever is in the dark with it and listening carefully enough to hear. The work of understanding this story is not finished. It will not be finished until someone reaches the end of the passage and comes back with an account of what is there, or until someone reaches the end and does not come back, which would itself be a kind of answer. Ren Asadourian is planning her return. The university archives hold the field journals. The Ottawa archive holds the misfiled letter with its pencil notation. The Winnipeg collection holds the Sobieski notebook. The Medicine Hat antique shop chain of custody eventually produced the Crace ledger. The Casca oral tradition continues in the communities that hold it. All of this is still active, still present, still part of a research project that has been ongoing for more than 40 years. and that shows no signs of concluding. The people who have given their professional lives to it have done so not because they expected to arrive at a final answer, but because the question is real, and the evidence is solid, and the work of careful documentation and honest inquiry is worth doing regardless of whether it produces the resolution that more dramatic presentations of mystery tend to promise. The story of the 1904 Liard Cave expedition is not a story with a resolution. It is a story with a shape, and the shape is the shape of the question it raises. And the question is as open as the cave's passage, and as patient as the limestone that has held the passage for 380 million years. The morning will come, the light will return to the plateau. The passage will still be there, waiting.